Ladies and gentlemen, today is May 25th, 2025. We are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Good evening. Doing pretty well. Yourself?
Can't complain.
That's good. We had a good week of Dota. I got promoted twice. Our honor mode run for our group wiped on Monday. Oops.
Oh, what
Against
happened?
the robot. We were
Which one?
the one underground in Grimforge.
Okay.
He's scary. We had a lot of damage types that were not good against him. We didn't have diluted oil of sharpness. We didn't craft all of the alchemy potions that we could have before the fight, and we were like 2 fights away from leveling up, so we probably should have done that first. So it was a mixture of lack of preparation and hubris, mainly. And a couple mechanical mistakes in the fight, but it was going to be hard any way you slice it with what we brought to the table for it. And he's a tough boss, so... Yep.
He is.
Once
That's
more to the
regrettable.
Nautiloid. Yeah.
Well, any other exciting developments?
Not too much. I'm going to be going to a wedding this next week, so probably won't have role discussion next Sunday because I'll be traveling and returning. But that's for one of my good friends from streaming, and I'll get to be best man and hang out
Cool.
over there. Yep. Yeah, I'm excited. It'll be nice to see some people I haven't seen in a while. Celebrate love and commitment and so on. Probably have some good food as well. I don't know if I told you, but my diet has shifted. I'm not eating vegan anymore, so
Yeah, you mentioned it.
yeah, my options have opened up. Hawaiian food, they have a lot of stuff that's very heavy, like dense in terms of the calories and stuff, but it's very good. And I really like fish, so there's a lot of poke and sushi and stuff there. It's good.
Well, sounds like you're in for a good time.
Yeah, looking forward to it. But we remade some characters after our wipe and got started again, and we're I think about to fight the goblin bosses in Act 1, but this time we have a dwarf who's a giant barbarian. My Tav is a moth ranger this time, tiefling, and then we have a goblin warlock. I think he's hexblade warlock, so he has a 2-handed sword, which is kind of funny. See a warlock with. And then we have, is it another paladin? Yeah, I think it's Oath of the Crown paladin. He's a half giant. So it wasn't super sad to wipe because that just means more time to game with the bros. But honor mode is no joke. There's a lot of stuff that can surprise you even when you've done the fights before.
Yeah, the unexpected will get you.
Mm-hmm. And we do go way faster than a team probably should. Just like running at fights and not really questioning too much. The run that I did with you was a lot more meticulous and careful, which that's what you want to have in honor mode.
Well, perhaps not as entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Well, the pace is slower, but I think it's still pretty entertaining. Love BG3, best game in the last 10 years. I had one funny customer when I was playing StarCraft yesterday who was trying to snipe me for 3 hours in queue against me, so I just asked him if they wanted to play some custom games like a normal person. But some people really want that attention. They agreed to it, so I played them 3 times. And then they were trying to snipe me more, but their MMR was too low to match against me, so they missed a bunch of times. Always amusing. And I went to a event in downtown Custer, which is a town of 2,000 people, Saturday evening, and they had a kind of country band with they had a drummer, a guitarist, a bass player, and then a fiddle player, which is violin, who is also the vocalist. and people were doing like different country dances to it and stuff. Very different culture than downtown Los Angeles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I bet.
More beer, less cocaine. That's one of the defining features.
Oh. So you went to a town called Custer in South Dakota.
Yes.
Interesting choice of name.
Yeah, it's named after General Custer.
Yeah, but generally you name towns after big heroes, not guys who die stupidly.
I think he did stuff before he died stupidly.
Yeah, he fought in the Civil War, but I don't think he did anything high profile. At least not to my knowledge.
I don't know. There's a breakfast place in town where you can get Custer's last meal because they evidently documented what it was. And it makes it kind of sound like it's going to be some archaeological frozen recreation of what he had, but they make it fresh. So it's just the same food that he had. It's not his actual ancient meal.
Well, I guess even the loser's corner of military history occasionally gets its attention.
Mm-hmm. It's a nice little town. It's pretty bougie as far as South Dakota stuff goes. They have fancy restaurants and stuff, and it's where a lot of people will stop in the summer for tourism and for motorcycle rallies and so on, because it's very close to Mount Rushmore.
A bougie South Dakota town. Never thought I'd hear that.
Well, as for South Dakota.
Or South Dakota, okay.
Yeah. Which
Is
is
it
still... Yeah, it's touristy during the summer, but it's brutal during the winter, so that's when you get to hang with the locals and stuff.
Gotcha.
The locals usually hunker down and hide during the peak tour season because it's crazy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Isn't there a big motorcycle event up there every year?
Mm-hmm. Sturgis motorcycle rally.
Sturgis, that's what it was. Okay.
Yeah. Apparently a bunch of people die every year. It's incredible. Like super crazy. People are very drunk. A lot of people are operating motorcycles who don't normally ride their motorcycles, so they're not skilled motorists.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty dicey time to be on the road, but tons of people show up for it every year. So it's a thing.
Yeah, I don't think I've historically heard as much about Sturgis. Generally, I hear more about, gosh, what's the other one? Myrtle Beach? Is that what it is?
We have a beach? Deadwood is
It's not in South Dakota.
Oh.
There's another big motorcycle rally every year in one of the Carolinas. I forget which.
I gotcha.
And I want to say it's at a place called Myrtle Beach, but I could be wrong. That's generally the one I think of when I think of big motorcycle meetups.
Mm-hmm.
But Sturgis has been around a long time, too.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of cowboy history out here. Saloons that were open during Gold Rush period and so on. So they have stories of like this guy. He was really good at like poker or something, but he was shot in the back in this saloon. It's like, okay. These were very violent times. The arm of the law was very limited, and it was more so who could show up with more thugs at a given time. That's who the enforcement was.
You know, that part of the United States was actually one of the last to be settled. Somewhat counterintuitively. You might think it would be further west, but actually the Great Plains was the last major region to be colonized because it was not very attractive. The soil's not that great, as I think you've discussed before.
Yes, that's why we buy fancy dirt.
Yeah. Yeah, the soil's not that great, and there's not a lot of trees, which is actually a problem if you're a settler back in the 19th century or earlier, because you need wood, you know, for like everything, you know, construction material, fuel, what have you. So if there's just no trees around, then you basically just have to pay for everything. You have to import everything into the region. So until the railroad came through, it really wasn't a feasible locale for settlement. In fact, I think in the early 19th century, they used to call the Great Plains the Great American Desert, because it was seemingly so inhospitable. But eventually the railroad did run through, and that made the importation of relatively cheap materials feasible. And so that allowed for the construction of towns, villages, what have you.
Yeah, another factor for the, I guess, slow population is the growing season is extremely short because the winters are very harsh. It's very far from major bodies of water. There are no oceans next to it, and it's even colder in the winter than some Great Lakes states because there isn't even a huge lake to moderate the temperature. So the temperature, at least when I first moved here, it got down to negative 24 Fahrenheit, which is quite yikesy cold. That's like spooky cold. The heat is leaving your body and you're confused about what to do, and you go inside and it doesn't help. So that was pretty exciting. But I could imagine it's before you have good heating systems and so on, you have to burn a lot of wood to be able to deal with the winters there. And the part of the state that we're in does have a lot of trees. It's the Black Hills region. But the rest of the state doesn't really have nearly as much timber.
Doesn't the Missouri River run through there somewhere?
I don't know.
I want to say that it does. I'm making shit up again. Let's see. Yeah, it does. Middle of the state, north-south. Both South Dakota and North Dakota, and then it veers west into Montana. So there's a little bit of water in the Dakotas, unlike, say, Nebraska or Kansas. But the point still stands. It is relatively dry. In fact, the agriculture there has historically been so poor that after there was settlement, after the American Civil War, it only lasted a couple decades before it significantly deteriorated. Because what happened is that the farmers that came in used poor farming practices, which eroded the topsoil. And there wasn't really a whole lot of topsoil to begin with, so once it was gone, the productivity of the region declined pretty markedly and fairly quickly. So a lot of people ended up having to leave. I think the Dust Bowl had it a lot worse than the Dakotas. I don't remember the Dakotas being hit as hard, but I think they were still impacted. And so even after the government started investing in education, trying to get people to take care of the soil better, which they eventually did, the result still was depopulation over an extended period of time. So while there were a lot of towns in sort of the Great Plains, especially the Western Great Plains, maybe 100 years ago or so, there's not nearly as many now. The Great Plains has been hit very hard by depopulation.
Did not know that.
Yeah, it's just not really economically viable these days, and there's better opportunities elsewhere. So between the pull of better opportunities and the higher costs of agriculture in the Great Plains, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think there was a wildlife group that actually proposed buying off some of the remaining land that's still settled and combining it with land that's been abandoned to create a big giant wildlife preserve to try to restore the buffalo.
Yeah,
apparently there's a
yeah, we drive around that all the time. That's really close to where we are. It's a beautiful wildlife preserve.
They actually went forward with it, huh?
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the background on my screen with the prairie dog, but that's on the preserve. They have all kinds of animals. It's really beautiful spot. You can just drive a loop through it, and the animals will walk right up to the road. Do not pet the furry cows. Those are buffalo, and they're wild, and they will kill you. There was a woman who was de-pantsed by a buffalo because she tried to take a selfie, and it bucked her in the air so high up, and her pants flew clean off. So
wow,
don't mess with the buffalo. Don't pet the animals. Don't feed the animals. It's a place where they can exist, but they're not tame.
Yeah, that's my understanding. They're very strong animals. Much bigger than a cow, too. Yeah, some people too risk tolerant, I guess, or maybe just ignorant.
I think it's probably ignorance rather than risk tolerance. I don't think you're accurately weighing, okay, this is a multi-ton animal, one of the largest animals on the planet, and I'm going to go up and try to be in proximity to this. You can go to a little wildlife center that's near it, and you get to sit on a scale or stand on a scale, and it compares your weight to the mass of a buffalo, and you're nowhere close to it. I think the weight of a human is like a 30th of a buffalo or something. So just their momentum, they could run you over super easily. It's not even really much of a contest.
Uh, yeah, it gives you an appreciation for the old Native Americans that used to hunt them. It was probably a fairly risky endeavor.
Yes, I would imagine extremely. They probably took some casualties doing that. So yeah. Part of the country that a lot of people don't talk about. It's beautiful, super low population. I think some of the lowest population states that exist. So, yeah.
Did most people listening are American, right? I think we still have the flags up somewhere.
Usually, yes.
Yeah, I don't see them, but yeah, usually it's mostly American. So most of you will already know what I'm about to say. But for those of you not from the United States, you may be interested. It used to be that the entire Great Plains was absolutely full of. No, what are we talking about? Buffalo. There we go. I was about to call them bison. Yeah, the Great Plains used to be absolutely full of buffalo. Like the herds went from horizon to horizon. There were so many. And what they would do is they would migrate north south, right? So during the winter, they would go south where it was warmer. And then during summer, they'd go back up north. And they did that for just umpteen centuries, however long they were there. And they were easily the dominant animal in the region by far. So the United States, when it kind of conquered the region and blew through, basically just annihilated them. And mostly that was through market mechanism, some of it from war. Obviously, there are stories about the US government getting into a war with the tribe, and so they would target the buffalo in the area to try to deny them that resource, because a lot of tribes in the Great Plains were completely dependent on the buffalo. They had kind of evolved a symbiotic relationship. But the bigger issue was food, specifically tongues, I think was the coup de grace. Buffalo tongue became a delicacy in restaurants on the East Coast of the United States in the late 19th century. And the result is that a whole bunch of hunters went into the Great Plains and started killing buffalo just for the tongues.
Ugh.
And then they would ship them out east for people to eat.
They're so massive. There's so much meat on those. Jeez Louise.
Yeah. Yeah, it was extremely wasteful, but it was easy money if you're a hunter.
Yeah.
And they were very easy to hunt with firearms just because there were so many. So it wasn't very costly to hunt them, or even to hunt a whole bunch of them and get a whole bunch of tongues. I think eventually they did start harvesting more of the animal. I do remember reading about bones of buffalo being used to make fertilizer. I'm not sure when it transitioned from just tongues to also other parts of the animal, but that did eventually happen. And so the result is that over the course of just a couple of decades, what had been a ubiquitous animal in the Great Plains was effectively endangered in a very short time. And so they almost disappeared just because of that. Also, of course, people settling the area, that obviously also disrupted them since people put up fences. And so the buffalo, of course, couldn't get through to their normal habitat. And then railroads, of course, also disrupted things since, trains running through would be slowed by them, which created an incentive to thin down the herd. I think at one point, trains even allowed people to bring guns on board so that they could just shoot buffalo for fun during their train trip across the Great Plains.
Wow.
You know, it was a very, very different time. And it was a very different region back in the day before it was fully settled.
Well, it probably seems so wild, and the buffalo being super numerous, people didn't really have the environmentally conscious mindset that we have today, where it's like, what if we shot all of them and there were none left, then we can't shoot anymore? Like, would that be a problem? Yeah, that would be a problem.
No, no, people didn't think like that, unfortunately. They just kind of took it for granted.
They do
But
a
in some cases, go ahead.
they do a buffalo roundup now, where they basically count the population, and there are restrictions on which ones can be used for like ranching versus how many you need to just kind of maintain as part of the wild population. So they are used for food still, but they're basically counted and protected at a certain point. So I think the population is pretty stable now.
Yeah, they've done a lot of good work there. My understanding is that the population is pretty healthy now and that they're making gains again.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you live long enough, you may yet get to see the Great Plains like they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
If we're fortunate. Not feeling especially fortunate these days, but we'll see.
If you ever want to come visit, we have extra beds and we could house you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's possible I may be up in the area in a few months. So I may take you up on that, depending on how things shake out.
Sure. Pick your ass up from the airport, even. We have a lot of...
finally give you that gift.
Yeah. We have a lot of guests out here because there's a lot of touristy stuff to do.
Ah, I see. But yeah, there was an incentive to get rid of them because of the disruption to the railways and to farmers and whatnot. So it wasn't entirely people just being crass and killing them for fun or even just for profit. So even if not for those factors, they probably would have been thinned considerably. But, all told, all factors combined pretty well wiped them out. Mm-hmm. And so the result is that the Great Plains went from being almost the equivalent of East African savanna in terms of like the diversity of wildlife and whatnot, to being more what we know it today, which is being mostly just a big giant rural breadbasket. Mm-hmm. Full of farms, but not much else.
Yeah, the growing season is super short, so the crops that you farm are very limited. We have a greenhouse that we use to put more of the more fussy plants that can't deal with freezes and things like that. Farming is hard. It's not something that's like, oh, you just put it in the ground and then it grows and then you're rich. It's not like that. There's a lot of stuff that's also trying to eat your crops too. So you see deer and you're like, oh, such a cute, nice deer. But a farmer says, hey, get away from my plants, bitch. It's a very different vibe.
Yeah, unfortunately, agriculture is very, very labor intensive. Everybody I've ever known or met who grew up with it has almost universally wanted to get away from it and do something else. Mm-hmm. Yeah, people kind of assume that the reason rural America is depopulating is because of some kind of some people think it's a conspiracy, like the government just doesn't give a shit about them. Some truth to that, but other people think it's like a moral decline. People aren't willing to do the hardy work of living in rural areas and just want to live easy. But the real answer is that people just want better opportunities. For the amount of work that you do on a farm, you don't really get all that much back for it. If you put in that same amount of labor in a more developed area, you would get much more significant returns.
Yeah, it's also more physical exertion than a lot of the more tech-oriented jobs that you can go for nowadays. Because for those, you get to basically be in a computer chair, which is a lot more calories out. It's still mental stress for sure, and that's all valid. But compared to actually digging and planning stuff and carrying shit around, that's a lot of intense manual labor that most people would prefer not to do if they can avoid it.
Yeah, but even if you're not intellectually inclined, even if you can't or don't want to do white collar type work, the labor intensive work you can do in cities or even just large towns generally will get you higher returns than the kind of labor than the kind of returns you'll get doing hard labor on a farm.
Mm-hmm.
There's good business to be had there.
True.
So the incentives are skewed against rural living, especially in a place that is not as productive, like the Great Plains region, especially the Western Great Plains region.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read anything about the history of tension between ranchers and farmers in the region?
No, it's almost all ranchers that I know of. At least in the area where I am, pretty much everyone is farming cattle, or they're raising horses to be like race horses or something, or chickens, or goats, or turkeys, or buffalo. But almost no one is farming like fields of crops, at least in our local area. So if there was a tension between the ranchers and the farmers, the ranchers won.
Well, makes sense. I guess that's part and parcel of that depopulation. Yeah, that was a big deal back in the late 19th century, especially. Because well before people started trying to farm the Great Plains, ranchers had moved in and were dominating it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there was kind of a sweet spot between the time of the buffalo, when they were ubiquitous and dominated the Great Plains, and the time of the farmer, specifically the time when farmers settled almost all of the Great Plains and carved it up into little fiefdoms. That sort of space in between those eras is basically the Wild West period. The Wild West is sort of mythologized in the United States, but the actual time period it took place in was like a very narrow period of time. It was like maybe 20 years in the late 19th century, 1870s, 1860s, kind of right around there. Yeah, the ranchers moved in first because, of course, it was much easier to just be a rancher. All you needed was a bunch of open land for cattle to graze on, and obviously that was available. And as the buffalo declined, there was more and more room for that. So what would happen is that people would have these big herds of cows, cattle, and then they would just roam them around freely. And when it was time to sell, they would just herd them out to railheads, specifically like towns connected to the railroads where they could load up the cattle and sell them, move them out east to the restaurants for people to get fat on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the cowboy economy for a while. And it was broken up basically by people moving in, buying land, farming and whatnot, because then people put up fences, and so your cattle couldn't just roam freely anymore. And that created tension because, of course, that was not crippling, but it inhibited the cattle economy. And so ranchers sometimes used violence and intimidation to try to scare off farmers, and then the farmers would fight back. It was a whole thing for a couple decades.
Well, I actually know of a specific law, now that you mention this, that is in favor of the ranchers, that we had to account for with our property, even though we don't have cows. If there are cows that go onto your property, it's your fault that your fence wasn't good enough to keep them out. Yeah. I thought that was pretty amusing. So definitely rancher-favored legislation there.
Yeah, victory for lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it stands to reason. But I guess as the farmers declined, the ranchers in turn kind of got back more authority. So I guess it's now more of a rancher-dominated state, more so than it was already anyway.
Yeah, I think just climate-wise, it makes more sense for that anyway, because the cows that they have here are really hardy and sturdy. I think most of them come from like Scotland or some shit, or like the cold parts of England, because the winters are so harsh. But if you have a barn and the cows are already pretty tough, then the cows can withstand a lot more than crops can.
Have you ever heard of the Ogallala Aquifer?
No, what's that?
It's a huge-ass underground aquifer that exists across much of the Great Plains. I don't think it's really in South Dakota much. But it's definitely a big deal in other parts of the Great Plains.
I think it might be, actually, because you can drill for water basically anywhere here. I think it was mentioned. I don't really recognize the name of it, but there's apparently really good water that's underneath us because of the underground water system, even though we don't really have good rivers.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the main source of fresh water for a lot of agricultural activity. It was built up over the course of thousands of years. Water would drain into the area and then it would settle. Well, the water that didn't drain off, through a river out into the ocean anyway, would settle into the aquifer. And it's taken a very long time for it to build up. So by the time farming started in the region, there was a pretty good sized reserve of fresh water for the farmers to use. The trouble is that there was so much agriculture that built up so quickly over the course of the late 19th century, early 20th century, that the aquifer began to dry out. So it's not, I think there's still a lot of water left, but the pace that it's being drained at is sufficiently high that there is a concern that it could run out within a few decades. And at that point, the main source of fresh water for that particular region of the Western Great Plains that it encompasses is going to be extinguished, and they're going to have to figure something else. Figure out some other source of fresh water, or maybe just abandon the region entirely, one or the other.
Cool stuff I didn't know about South Dakota.
Yeah, it's a quiet little region. Kind of minds its own business for the most part. Very different than the South. The South does not mind its own business.
Yeah. That's true. They have big personality.
Yeah. Yeah, some more trivia for those of you not from the United States. And again, for those of you who are American, this is going to be redundant. You already know this. The South and the Great Plains, especially the northern Great Plains that we're talking about right now, were settled by very different people. The South was largely settled by Scots-Irish people and also some English people from the Caribbean. Whereas, in contrast, the northern Great Plains was settled much more so by Germans. Also some Scandinavians as well, and a smattering of other people, but Germans were the most pronounced group. So much so that the capital of North Dakota, do you know this, Neuro, the capital of North Dakota?
Mm-mm.
Bismarck.
Not even New Bismarck, it's just old Bismarck.
Yeah. Yeah, it was not subtle. They very specifically named the capital of their state after one of the great leaders of their home country. I think South Dakota is Pierre. Is that correct?
Sounds right. I should know this. I don't know this.
I'd have to look it up. But yeah, lots and lots of Germans in the area. And they actually still spoke German into the early 20th century, even after they'd been settled for a few generations. And they'd probably still be speaking German today, except for World War I, during which time the US government did some not very nice things to the Germans in the United States, even if they were citizens who had been here a long time. And there was a lot of pressure on German citizens German American citizens, I should say, to speak English. The idea that they would still be speaking German after all this time was seen as suspicious, and people were wary of them because they thought maybe they'd be loyal to Germany still, which was a country that the United States was at war with during World War I. So once the U.S. jumped into the war, there was both government pressure and communal pressure from within their own communities to distance themselves from Germany and German culture and to speak less German. And so the result is that a whole bunch of communities that had still been predominantly speaking German shifted very quickly to predominantly speaking English. There's still a few older folks around who kind of still speak German, but there are very few and far between now. The vast majority of people have now assimilated into the broader Anglo culture.
Yeah, the American Nations book that I've been reading actually talks a lot about that, about the German settlements and how they had very distinctly German ways of doing things. Like they built their houses out of stone when they could rather than wood. They also had more permanent fixed settlements where it wasn't as much like slash and burn, put whatever you want in the ground and just kind of use the soil until it's fucked and then move somewhere else. They would try to rotate the crops and have it be more sustainable because they were some of the most experienced and expert farmers just for their technique. And they also had some religious differences with the other groups too. And they were closer to the Yankees in terms of being more pro-education than some of the Scots-Irish, which are more like pro-stab you.
Yeah.
There was a whole chapter on the culture of like Scots-Irish Appalachian communities and how it wasn't about how much money you made. It wasn't about like what your education level was. It wasn't about who you voted for. It was about whose face you could claw the hardest at the bar and then just bragging about stories of who you were able to beat up. So it was very kind of ape-like chest beating, violent first, questions later sort of culture.
Yeah.
And they were very skeptical of educated people. So if you talked in a way that was different from them, they would think that you were trying to swindle them or talk down to them or whatever. So the early nations of the US, even if they came from Europe, many of them were just so different that they couldn't get along at all. But yeah, German was definitely a distinct group of its own that kind of kept to itself. And then the Scots-Irish were a very different strategy. And a lot of their violence came from the situation that they were in before they came to the Americas. So they're kind of using the tools that they had cultivated, having to fight for the space that they were in Europe.
Yeah, the Germans in the 1600s that came over to the United States were largely people who were used to sedentary agriculture, but who had been basically displaced by the endemic warfare of the 17th century. For those who maybe aren't familiar with that, the 17th century saw almost continuous warfare across Europe for most of that 100 years. In fact, I don't think there was a single year in the whole century, maybe one, when there was not a war somewhere in Europe. So it was a very violent period. The 30 Years' War in particular was immensely disruptive, and that affected Germany specifically. I think something like 1/3 of Germany's population was wiped out because of that conflict. So good incentive to get the fuck out if you could and settle somewhere else. And a number of Germans chose to move to the nascent North American colonies, such as they were at the time, to try to build a new life for themselves. So they were used to, they were sedentary. They knew how to develop a farm, maintain a farm. They just wanted to get away from violence. Now, the Scots-Irish, by contrast, as you've insinuated, were more of a frontier people. They were actually used to violence. They themselves were very tribal. They didn't have a lot of urban life until maybe sometime in the 1700s. And a lot of them ended up getting displaced or incentivized to relocate from the Scottish Highlands. Well, not the Scottish Highlands, but the border region between England and Scotland, which of course saw many wars between Scotland and the English. A number of those people in particular ended up moving to Ireland as part of a program that the English crown set up to try to settle Ireland with people that were more loyal to the English crown. I don't know why they thought Scottish people would be a good choice for that, but that's what they did. And the result is that these people who were used to violence, because they were used to tribal warfare amongst themselves and also fighting with the English, now found themselves in a new frontier where they were surrounded by angry natives that didn't want them there, that being the Irish. So now you have this second level of selection where you have people who are already violent now being sort of winnowed out and filtered for people who can survive and thrive in the even greater turbulence of living in plantation Ireland. So those people, some of them anyway, grew tired of living with that, not so much because of the violence, but because they didn't like the English. So they decided to leave for an even more dangerous place, which was the 17th century American frontier. And largely they settled on land that was pretty bad because they didn't have a lot of money. These were generally relatively poor people. And so they gravitated more towards the hills and the mountains. because obviously if you want to settle and build a nice farm, that's not where you're going to go. You want to go where it's flat and where the soil is nice. So the Scots-Irish headed for the hills, and they largely created their own sort of little tribal society up there, and they've retained a distinct identity ever since. And that identity retains traces of that sort of violent frontier past they had in England and Ireland. So they've always been known for being sort of these very rambunctious, contentious people. Hence the contrast between the American West and the American South.
Yeah.
The South is known for being more violent, more restive, more dramatic, if you like. Whereas the West kind of has its drama, but it's much more restrained. It's more orderly, even when it's being restive. It's
About what point does the West begin as a region?
The West, as we know it today, probably formed up in the late 1800s, and maybe even later in the early 20th century. It was the last region to be settled. So there wasn't really much going on there until the mid-late 1800s. There's always been a West of one kind or another, but the specific region that we think of as the West now is basically the area between the Mississippi, well, maybe not the Mississippi, the area roughly encompassing the Great Plains and then west to the West Coast. Stopping short of the West Coast, obviously. The West Coast is kind of a region unto itself. So, you can think of like Idaho, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, etc. Mm-hmm. That area, roughly.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I've seen some definitions of the Midwest that sometimes go up into the Dakotas, because there is some overlap between the people who settled the Midwest and the people who settled the Dakotas. Obviously, Minnesota is right next to the Dakotas, so, it makes sense. And Minnesota and Wisconsin are a part of what's called the Upper Midwest. And that was settled by a combination of people who were more German, but also New Englanders, specifically Puritans and whatnot. They, in particular, settled the Upper Midwest, as well as parts of the northern part of the rest of the Midwest. So some of those people ended up moving into the Dakotas and influenced the culture there a little more so than, say, further south in Kansas or Nebraska, where there's not nearly as much of a New Englander presence there historically.
And then the French would have been concentrating more in Canada, Louisiana.
Yeah, Quebec, Louisiana. They originally settled Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, too, if I remember correctly. But then as a result of losing the War of Spanish Succession, the French population of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia ended up getting expelled. Britain got both of those territories, and they just made the French people leave, or I don't remember if it was full-on expulsion or if the conditions under English rule were just sufficiently unpalatable that people preferred to leave. But the result was the same. The French population ended up leaving. And so Nova Scotia and Newfoundland ended up being settled mostly by English people whose descendants continue to dominate the population today.
Cool.
Yeah, they also settled a bit between Louisiana and Quebec, along the Trans-Mississippi, basically. For those maybe not familiar with the geography, the St. Lawrence Seaway is, if you're traveling from, Northern Europe west directly to North America, the St. Lawrence Seaway is the first major waterway that you'll encounter that leads into the interior of North America. And because the French were the first to get there, they settled the region and then also penetrated down the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes, which are another obvious, main avenue of transportation, and then used the Great Lakes to explore the surrounding area, which led them eventually to the Mississippi. And then in turn, they sailed down the Mississippi to the mouth of the river at present-day New Orleans, which they, of course, founded and settled. And so the French, by dint of having easy access to the interior waterways of North America, penetrated very deep into the continent very quickly well before other countries like the English or the Dutch that were also settling and exploring North America at the time. And so New France, as it was called, encompassed not only Quebec, but also the Great Lakes region, good chunk of the Ohio Valley, and then, of course, all of the Mississippi, all the way down to the Louisiana Delta. So it was a huge chunk of territory, but it was very thinly populated for most of the time that France nominally controlled it. In fact, France never even really controlled it at all. They claimed it. They had a few trading stations along the Mississippi that were mostly populated by fur traders who took full advantage of the ubiquity of beavers and various other kinds of animals whose pelts sold very highly in Europe, because beaver hats and felt hats were very popular in Europe in the 1600s and fetched a very high price. So fur trading was very profitable at the time, which is what kind of spurred a lot of early exploration of the interior of North America. So French fur traders were not uncommon in the region, but they weren't really interested in settling, farms, towns, that kind of thing. They just wanted to set up trading posts to buy furs from Indians and then take them back for sale at a major port somewhere. So in turn, even though the French were there for like 150 some years, the French population of the Trans-Mississippi in particular and the Great Lakes was pretty sparse. Not like Quebec or Louisiana, by contrast, where those areas were more built up. So this is actually why a lot of place names along the Mississippi and in the Great Lakes have French origin. So, for example, Detroit, that was originally a French name. St. Louis, that was an outpost founded by French settlers. I think those are the most well-known examples, but I'm sure there's a multitude of lesser-known towns that have French origin names.
I didn't think of Detroit being a French name based on how we pronounce it.
Well, we Anglos tend to kind of bastardize the name of things.
St. Louis, to be fair, is that named after King Louis? Or who's St. Louis?
I think so. Oh. Well, actually, yeah, you're right. St. Louis, so it must be a saint. That would make more sense. Let's see. Etymology. No, it doesn't have etymology. Huh. Well, I'll defer to chat on that. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. This is a good cue for it. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy economics. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it eventually. So, feedback is appreciated.
There was one fun South Dakota fact that I wanted to mention before I forget it. Sea of Whiskey was saying that you can enjoy exploding trees in the winters of South Dakota because the freeze is so harsh that it causes the sap to expand and the tree will explode with a bunch of bark shrapnel. So stay safe.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there's always something to kill you in nature, it seems.
Yep. We've got a lot of cougars here in the kind of Custer area, so you have to be careful of that. And there are mountain lions as well.
Mountain lion, that's more of a recent thing, isn't it? The mountain lions?
I don't think so, but maybe.
I thought they had been mostly wiped out and they were reintroducing them over the past couple decades.
Unsure, but they're something that can limit the deer population, and the deer are pretty overpopulated because there used to be bears in the region and they're not anymore. Cougars don't really kill people that often, so.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I would certainly make for a tempting meal if I did come up there.
Yeah, they only tend to go for humans if they're really desperate or injured, but it's not their preferred. We're pretty noisy and obnoxious, so I prefer to go for a deer. Well, there was one recent news item that chat was asking about as we were getting started. They were wondering about the Germans sending troops into the Baltics.
I thought they did that semi-regularly. NATO's been deploying troops intermittently. Well, not intermittently. They started deploying troops to the Baltics after 2014, after the whole Crimean imbroglio. And they've had a continuous presence there since then, but they circulate out deployments amongst different member states. And so I had thought that Germany had been participating in that, and that occasionally has just had troops there every so often. So I don't know why a new troop deployment would be all that notable.
Maybe.
Yeah. If there's some new development there, I haven't heard of it. But my impression is that any kind of NATO deployment to the Baltics is, for the most part, unremarkable. It's just part of business as usual for the past 10 years.
What is the usual business? Like, what are they trying to stabilize?
Basically, they're just trying to deter Russia. Have you ever heard of the Suwalki Gap?
Sounds familiar, but I don't know what it is.
Am I even pronouncing it correctly? Suwalki Gap. Okay. So if you look at a map, actually, I'll send you a visual aid. You can look at it later. But this is a nice map. Basically, Russia has an enclave in Europe, a little piece of territory separated from the rest of Russia called Kaliningrad. Mm-hmm. And there's a gap between that territory and Belarus, which is obviously a big Russian ally that Russia has troops deployed in. There's a gap between them that connects Poland with the Baltic states. And this is the main land connection that the rest of NATO has to the Baltic NATO member states. And so that gap is a security concern, because if the Russians did launch some kind of pincher movement from Kaliningrad and Belarus, they could cut off the Baltics from the rest of NATO. Obviously, that would still leave a sea connection, but the land connection has been of concern. Now, not a whole lot of attention was paid to that over the course of the Baltics' NATO membership, starting around, I think, 2004, if I'm not mistaken, because relations with Russia were sufficiently quiet that people didn't really care. And also, NATO had an informal agreement with the Russians not to deploy any troops into Eastern Europe for many years up until, again, 2014. So it wasn't really seen as a big issue, but once tensions with Russia started escalating, of course, that changed. So then NATO started paying more attention to not only the gap, but also the vulnerability of the Baltics in general, which face either Russian territory or Russian allies to their southwest, southeast, and immediate east, which makes them relatively vulnerable. So what do you do about that? NATO ultimately decided to start deploying troops into the Baltics so that they could at least have a presence there in order to discourage the Russians from trying anything. One particular concern has been this idea that the Russians, if they were so inclined, could launch a big offensive into the Baltics, seize the Baltics very quickly, and then just sit on them and basically dare NATO to do something about it. And given how wishy-washy sentiment in the West has been over the past couple decades about military interventions of one kind or another, there is a sentiment that maybe there would be enough political support for not helping the Baltics in that case that the Russians might be able to get away with it. So there's a sense that NATO needs to fortify the Baltics to some degree in order to ensure that the Russians are not tempted by that possibility. And so having troops there has become a cornerstone of a sort of emerging doctrine for Eastern Europe, which had largely gone undeveloped since the end of the Cold War.
I did not know this.
Let's see. There's your picture. Yeah, very, very clearly shows the Suwalki Gap in the picture I sent you.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, it used to be during the Cold War that NATO planning very much centered around what was called the Fulda Gap, which was this gap in in West Germany anyway, near the border with East Germany, where Soviet armor was expected to penetrate in an effort to try to get to the coast and isolate NATO troops in northern West Germany, if not also the Low Countries. I think there was even a video game called The Fulda Gap at one point in the 80s.
Wow. I like when video games teach us history. It saves you from needing to read stuff.
well, that's one way of looking at it. But yeah, after the Cold War ended, people didn't really pay attention to the Fulda Gap anymore because the frontier of NATO obviously moved well to the east over the subsequent 15-some years. But because there was no sense that war was a real threat in Eastern Europe, there were no real plans drawn up for Eastern Europe and conflict therein, presumably with Russia. So NATO has kind of been scrambling to make up for lost time and trying to develop plans for how to actually defend places like the Baltics or Poland or what have you that might be threatened by the Russians in the case of conflict. And of course, now that Finland is a member, they have this whole new frontier that they have to account for, which is quite large. So I'm sure there's been a scramble to try to plan for that as well.
Yeah, one of the best StarCraft players in the world is from Finland, and he's doing some of his mandatory military conscription. But they gave him a special, not exemption, but he has access to a computer and stuff so he can continue to compete and train because he's kind of like a national hero. Global Esport Random Finland, dude. It's the best Zerg.
What was his name?
Cyril.
Cyril. Okay, I think I've heard that before.
I'm a fan.
Yeah, Finland is a fun country.
Have you seen the movie Sisu? Or heard of it?
I feel like I should. What's it about?
It's like a Finnish gold miner guy, and it's set at the very end of World War II where the Nazis have been defeated, but there's still Nazi troops kind of scattered about, and this guy, he's got a lot of military experience and stuff, and he's trying to defend himself as they're doing their retreat and so on.
Gotcha.
But it's not exactly historical, it's like more of an action movie, but the setting is very fun, so.
Interesting. Thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah, it's a fun watch.
Yeah, I was going to say that the most important thing to know about Finland is that it's the leading supplier of hockey players for the Dallas Stars.
Yeah. Jere Lehtinen, let's go.
Hell yeah. Yeah, they've apparently still got a bunch of Finnish players on the team. So thank you, Finland. Much appreciated.
Good hockey.
Yeah, Finland loves death metal. I think that's well established.
Yep.
But it's also different than the rest of Scandinavia. In fact, technically, it's not even part of Scandinavia. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and also Iceland are your Scandinavian countries. So they have Germanic cultures, languages, etc. Finland does not. Finnish language and culture is not Germanic in origin. It's actually it used to be called Urguic Altaic, something like that. I'm not sure what they're calling it these days, but basically they have their origins more in Siberia. Mm-hmm. And their language is part of a completely different language tree than the German language tree.
Yeah, and similarly they get confused with being a Viking nation as well, when they were not. It's
Correct.
Part of Scandinavia geographically, but culturally and ethnically, and just in terms of the Viking history, they're their own thing. Definitely hardy people, but they're not the Swedish, Danish, and Norwegians. Different group.
Yeah, they have more in common with Estonia, actually, culturally speaking. I think their languages are actually in the same language tree, although they are distinct languages. Yeah, Finland for a long time was just kind of a frontier territory. So different, more powerful kingdoms along their periphery would dominate them for periods of time. I think originally they were dominated mostly by Swedes in the Swedish Empire in the 1500s and 1600s. And so as a result, a lot of Finland's nobility, even up until the early 20th century, were actually ethnically Swedish, either even at that time or in origin. In other words, some of them had assimilated to some degree. And I think Swedish remained a prestige language in Finland for several centuries, even after it wasn't part of Sweden anymore. They ended up part of Russia. Russia successfully took that territory from them, I want to say in the 1700s. Could be wrong, but that's what I'm thinking. But it remained part of Russia for roughly 200 years, right up until World War One. Russia, of course, collapsed during World War One on account of the February and October revolutions. And a number of Western territories in Russia managed to successfully break away. Ukraine was actually one of them, but it was very brief. It wasn't long before the Russian Civil War engulfed them, and they ended up back part of Russia again. Belarus as well, similar story. But I believe it was Moldova, as we know it today, which actually ended up breaking off and being absorbed by Romania, which had long claimed Moldavia. So they successfully left. And then, of course, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they all achieved their independence in that period, and then Finland as well. So all of them became independent. It didn't last. Obviously, the Soviets, over the course of the 1930s and 40s, were able to reconquer almost all of those territories. They got Moldova back, I think before World War II even started. I think they intimidated the Romanians into giving it back to them. And then, of course, there was an agreement with the Germans to allow the Russians into the Baltic states. So they just sent the Red Army in, and the Baltic armies just were not capable of defending themselves. So the result is that the Soviets just kind of moved in and annexed them. They were planning on re-annexing Finland as well, which led, of course, to the famous Winter War that military history buffs all know about. Mm-hmm. But of course, the Red Army got a bloody nose in that, and the Finns, while they lost territory, were able to retain their sovereignty. After that, they actually linked up with the Nazi Germans and helped them in the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. But even after the Germans ended up losing, even after the tide turned against the Germans, the Soviets briefly tried to invade Finland again. It didn't go especially well, and the Finnish government offered them a deal in which they would basically just surrender if they agreed not to conquer and subjugate them. And that was a fairly attractive deal to the Soviets, and so they agreed to it and just kind of moved on. And that's actually how Finland was able to retain their independence, even after going to war with the Soviet Union during World War II. Of course, they had to make a number of compromises. They were very famously Finlandized during the Cold War, and that is actually the technical term for it. That was a term reflecting the fact that they were nominally neutral. They didn't side with either East or West in the Cold War, but they also did not have a fully independent foreign policy. It was, to a degree, subordinated to Soviet whims. And so that was a very particular set of circumstances that was sufficiently different than actual neutrality, that the international relations literature gave it its own technical term, Finlandization. And that's where Finland remained until the end of the Cold War, when they finally, well, I shouldn't say broke away. They were already independent. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were more free to steer an independent course. And so in the 1990s, they joined, for example, the European Union, where before that was not necessarily in the cards.
It seems like because they took some really good defensive fights, even if they lost, they did well enough that they had leverage to maintain more autonomy than a state that was just completely leveled would be able to argue for.
Completely level?
I'm saying, like, if it was a very one-sided, the Soviets just go and clean house and it's very easy for them to take Finland, then it would be a lot easier to make it more Russian. But because, say, in the Winter War, they defended themselves relatively well, they had more of a bargaining chip.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If not for that, they would have been the newest of the Soviet socialist republics. As was, they were able to stay independent, specifically, as you say, because they were able to mostly fend off the offensive.
Yeah. So it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians in a certain way. Like, not that they lost per se, but the trade was so bad, they lost so many lives and gained so little ground for it that it was a very ugly victory that didn't really feel like something you could boast about.
Yeah, and it actually did damage to their international esteem in a way that contributed to Operation Barbarossa. That's the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Germans probably would have invaded anyway, but German commentators noted the poor performance of the Red Army in the Winter War, and they cited that as one of the reasons that they were confident that if and when they did eventually invade the Soviet Union, it would probably go really well, and the Soviets would probably just collapse after a few months.
But defenders' advantage is strong. That's a factor too.
It's pretty strong. But in the Soviets' case, kind of a mixed bag. They didn't manage it that well for stretches of the war, specifically in the first year. Their defender's advantage was not well used then for a variety of reasons. Actually, we still haven't talked about the Eastern Front, have we?
Oh, I think that was on the to-do. We did the Pacific Theater.
Yeah. Yeah, when we did Pacific Theater, there was a famous history podcaster. I forget his name. I think his name, Dan Carlin, I think it was. He was actually doing a podcast series on it at the same time. So some people accused me of just regurgitating stuff from that. So appropriately enough, now that I'm thinking about the Eastern Front again, there's a famous YouTube channel called Kings and Generals. Probably almost all of you listening have heard of it. That's doing a series on the Eastern Front now. So if we do the Eastern Front, I'm sure that I will be accused again of just regurgitating that. But it has also just started. So if we do it now, we could get ahead of it.
Oh, nice. Well, I can always intersperse some random dumb shit and bad jokes, so that way that it isn't just a direct copy pasta.
There you go. Yeah, I haven't really prepared for it like I did the Pacific thing, but I could just do broad strokes, give you a rough idea. Yeah, I think I had more detailed stuff in an earlier attempt at doing it, but that's just not finished yet. So I guess I would start by saying, what do you know about the Eastern Front? Just roughly, give me like a rough idea of where I could start.
So I know that because Germany was kind of trying to juggle the Western Front of putting pressure on France and England, and like having the threat of the United States getting in there just kind of in the back of their mind, that we talked about Africa a little bit. I don't know if that counts as Eastern Front stuff.
No,
it doesn't. Okay.
Totally different. Yeah, the Eastern Front just refers exclusively to the Russian front. North Africa was British.
Would that not count when they were like conquering Poland and so on?
Still the Eastern Front. Again, Eastern Front, just synonym for Russo-German War, World War II.
Okay, well, let's just say I don't know shit about it.
All right. That's a broad ambit then.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, where do I even start? I think Kings and Generals is still doing their preamble. Whenever they do a series, they always have a brief, short mini series detailing the lead up to the war and all the factors. So if anybody's interested in learning about the Eastern Front, Kings and Generals is the way to go. I'm sure they're going to do way better than just me on my own. Most of what I know about it is from my buff days, my Eastern Front history buff days when I was in high school. And I read, for one, military atlases, which were a hobby at the time, but also some David Glantz books. For those of you who don't know who David Glantz is, David Glantz is a military history author, researcher, academic, basically all three. He actually worked for the U.S. Army. And at the tail end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, he actually did a lot of research on the Soviet Army and whatnot in order to help the Army kind of learn more about their opponent and whatnot. And part of the research he did was specifically on the performance of the Red Army during World War II. And he kind of spun that out into a career writing about the Eastern Front in World War II that has produced some of the leading, if not the leading, English language literature on the subject. And so, of course, as a war nerd in high school, I was very attracted to that and sought out some of his work. I haven't read everything he's written. I've read more the overall summaries that he's written of the Eastern Front. A lot of the stuff he's written has been about specific offensive or periods during the war. And a lot of that I have not read yet. I actually just got one of his books in the mail the other day, and it's a book that I've been meaning to read for 20 fucking years. I just kept putting it off because of one thing or another. So I finally have it, so I'm actually really excited to kind of get through that at some point.
Nice.
But I am sufficiently familiar to give you like a broad review. I think I could at least do that, even though I'm very rusty. Gosh, where to start? I guess kind of the end of World War I, roughly. Because at the end of World War I, you kind of see the seeds for the German invasion of Russia. Because at that time, of course, Germany is just a shit show. You know, it's mired in revolution, discord. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles were very harsh, so the economy wasn't doing very good. And Russia was going through the Russian Civil War. And so if you know anything about the Russian Civil War, you know that, you know, if you were living in Russia at that time, you were pretty much fucked in a variety of ways. Very violent period for Russia. So without getting into all of the history of that stuff, basically that sets the stage for a very politically unstable 1920s for both countries. And there actually was a fair amount of recovery, especially in Germany in the mid-late 1920s. They were doing a good deal better, even economically. But then the Great Depression hit, and then everything kind of went to shit. Now, the Soviets weren't as affected by that because, of course, they had a command economy. And a lot of countries didn't want to trade with them or even recognize their government because they were seen as extremists, which they were. The Bolsheviks were not just communists. The Bolsheviks were the most extreme manifestation of communism at that time. They were like the far left of the far left in the political spectrum of Russia, if not Europe as a whole. There were a variety of relatively more moderate leftists, like the Mensheviks in Russia, and the radical socialists that were also far left, but were not as extreme as the Bolsheviks. And it's a testament to their drive for power, you know, their ambition that they were able to successfully sideline even nominal allies like those in order to seize complete control of what had been the Russian Empire. And that is what the Soviet Union was. This is kind of a framing thing, but one way to frame the Soviet Union is as a Russian Empire as seized and run by ultra-violent left-wing extremists. Because by and large, the borders of the Russian Empire were the borders of the Soviet Union, with the exception of Eastern Europe, obviously changing hands a great deal in the interwar years. So Russia, before World War I, had seen fairly significant economic growth, but it was still well behind the rest of Europe. It did not have modern industry. Its logistical systems were not up to snuff. That was specifically one of the reasons the Russian army struggled so much during World War I. Logistical difficulties. The more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. So when the Soviets took over, they were taking over a country that was in the throes of transformation into something resembling a modern country, but was in the very, very early stages of that transformation. And so they endeavored very quickly to try to modernize it. Now, in the 1920s, mixed results. The early part of the 1920s was more about finishing up the Russian Civil War and consolidating power. They even had a lot of compromises in the early mid-1920s as far as economic policy because things were just too dysfunctional for the party to exercise significant economic policy making. Those of you familiar with the period probably remember the new economic policy, which was Lenin's reform of his own government's economic policy to basically allow a degree of free market economics. Before, they had been doing a lot of pie in the sky sort of ideologue stuff as far as trying to centralize economic activity, and it did not go especially well. So, in order to try to stabilize the economy within Bolshevik territory, which was suffering from hyperinflation, food shortages, etc., Lenin tried to loosen up controls with his new economic policy. And communists ever after have argued about that, about whether that was a betrayal or a necessity or what have you. But it was very controversial even at that time. So that illustrates the instability of the period. But by the late 20s, the communists had sufficiently consolidated power that they were able to actually start doing real economic planning. And the result was the famous 5-year plans of the late 1920s and then the 1930s. And it was in that period when they really started focusing on industrialization. And it was fairly effective. It kind of mixed some like small-scale free market stuff with a lot of state-led investment. But it didn't really kind of hit high gear until the early 1930s, at least as I understand it. And a lot of very dirty compromises had to be made to make that work. It was not as clean-cut as maybe some ideologues remember it. There was a lot of indigenous development, and by that I mean that they did invest in a lot of education, produce a lot of engineers, and those engineers were put to work developing new industries and whatnot. But a lot of Soviet industrialization was actually just buying factory equipment from the West and then setting up factories in the Soviet Union. Sometimes they even had, actually not sometimes, very frequently, even setting up and constructing the factories would be done by Western corporations, somewhat ironically. Now, that's not to say that, that's not a knock against Soviet industrialization, right? It's much easier to buy the capital equipment you need in order to start producing stuff in a modern way than it is to try to create the whole supply chain of, factory equipment from scratch. That was pretty much inevitable that they would end up just importing a lot of stuff. The issue is more how they afforded the factory equipment that they were importing. They didn't really have a lot to trade because, again, Russia was basically still a developing country at that time. I think their biggest export for a long time was wheat and minerals. And wheat can only get you so far. Even if you're exporting a lot, it's relatively low value. So minerals ended up being what the Soviets focused on, and especially gold. Now, they did have something of a mining industry in place, but what they really needed was a significant scaling up. And if you're going to scale up mining, you need a much larger workforce. You're going to need miners. And they didn't really have a lot of volunteers for that, but what they did have is a whole lot of people in concentration camps. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up building concentration camps around gold mines and then using the labor of the convicts within, many of whom were not there for any substantive reason. A lot of them were political prisoners, and a lot of those political prisoners were there for bullshit reasons. They pissed off a neighbor, and then the neighbor informed on them, and then they end up in a camp as a political enemy of one kind or another. So those people suffered grievously because obviously the concentration camps were not especially well run or supplied. The plan basically was just to work them to death in the mines. But by doing that, they were able to produce a lot more gold and other valuable minerals that they could sell in the West for hard currency that they could then turn around and use to buy the factory equipment that they needed in order to industrialize their economy. That was a model that was very violent, but it was also very effective. And the result is that Soviet industry significantly increased over the course of the 1930s. And by extension, their ability to produce war equipment also correspondingly increased, which allowed them to more or less survive World War II intact. There's obviously a debate there about the degree to which the Soviets relied on their own industry as opposed to Western aid, but that's a whole other conversation. We can save that for later. But the takeaway here is that the Soviets, again, Bolsheviks, far left-wing extremists, were able to seize control of what had been the Russian Empire, a fairly rural and backwards empire, and through central planning, were able to significantly advance the industrial development of that country into something resembling a peer, or at least a near peer, of equivalent countries in Central and Western Europe. Germany didn't have that problem. That is to say, they already had a developed economy. But what they did have is a big chip on their shoulder from World War I and a relatively meek embrace of liberal democracy. There were some elections in Germany before World War I, And obviously, they set up a democracy in the wake of World War I in the form of the Weimar Republic. But a lot of people were not happy about that. A lot of people really thought that monarchy was still the way to go, or maybe constitutional monarchy. So the Weimar Republic was never especially popular with either the far left or the far right in Germany. The far right wanted to return to something like monarchy, if not just outright monarchy. And then the far left, of course, wanted something more like what the Soviets had. And there was a sort of thin middle ground, a center of the political spectrum that was filled with liberal Democrats of one kind or another. But they were just not powerful enough to ultimately hold the line against the radical forces of Germany. And for reasons that are more complicated than I'm going to be able to get to in the short time I'm talking about this, eventually fascists were able to seize control in Germany and take power. And their approach to managing their economy was less ambitious than the Soviets. They already had a developed economy to work with. They did want to try to get it running again, because obviously the Great Depression had taken a toll. And so they spent a lot of money, on infrastructure and various things like that in order to prime the pump, so to speak, to use the old Keynesian parlance. And to a degree, that did work. Unemployment did fall. I understand there's some debate about that, but overall, conditions improved sufficiently for the Nazis to claim, with some credibility, that they were improving the economy of Nazi Germany. So let's put it like that. Very diplomatic. Mm-hmm. At the same time they were doing that, and this is the more relevant aspect here, they secretly started investing in war production, which they were not supposed to do. By the Treaty of Versailles, their war production was very severely restricted. But they used a variety of tricks in order to restart that war production. And by the time the Allies kind of figured out what was going on, they were behind.
That's not a gun, that's mining equipment.
Yeah. Yeah, what they would do is they would set up fake companies, and the fake company would basically attract investment from actual private sector companies, and the government would kind of reimburse the private sector for doing that. A lot of these fake companies, in turn, kind of had real existences on stock markets and whatnot, and so seemed real, but in reality, they were just fronts for the government to divert resources into factories that were producing war equipment of one kind or another. On paper, they were producing, cars, radios, whatever, metallurgy, but actually it was, tanks, planes, weapons, etc. And again, by the time the Allies figured it out, they were behind in war production, and more importantly, their publics were still not that interested in actually enforcing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany actually had a lot of sympathizers in the West, a lot of people who felt like the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh, and that in so much as Nazis had seized power because conditions in Germany were bad, that the Western Allies, in turn, were somewhat culpable in the rise of the Nazis. So there was a sense then that it would be better just to kind of take their foot off the pedal, so to speak, to allow the Germans to breach certain parts of the Treaty of Versailles in order to try to ease tensions. And that, of course, evolved into what eventually became appeasement, and we all know how well that went. But the takeaway here is that the Germans were able to, on account of these factors, successfully able to rebuild their war machine. So this pretty much gets us up to the late 1930s. I've skipped a lot of details and whatnot, but I want to just try to get into the war here. I think I can do all of it. Again, just doing a summary of it. But I'm going to have to try to skip over a lot of stuff. So by the late 1930s, both countries are more or less ready for war, at least in the sense that they've sufficiently built up their armies that they could feasibly conduct large-scale military operations. The caveat is that the Germans, specifically under Hitler, were actually planning for war, either one started by them or somebody else. But their plan was to be ready for that ultimate confrontation by 1944. In 1939, they were ahead of the Allies and they'd made a lot of investments. However, they were still not ready for a full-on war. In fact, a lot of German officers believed that if they did go to war in 1939, that they would lose. That had been their forecast earlier during the whole crisis with the Sudetenland. And then again during the Austrian crisis, Anschluss. German officers recognized they had some advantage in war production over the Allies, but that combined, if they fought a war against both Britain and France, their combined militaries would be more than enough to overwhelm the German army, such as it was in the late 30s, and they would lose handily. And as a result, specifically because of that, a lot of German officers thought Hitler was very bad for Germany because he kept taking what they perceived to be very stupid risks. If they went right, there was some gain, but if they went wrong, then Germany would be invaded and occupied, and that would obviously be very, very bad. So there was a lot of tension between the Nazis and the German military on that count. Obviously, there wasn't a lot they could do about it because Germany under the Nazis was a totalitarian state. So speaking out was very risky. But contrary to what you might expect, the German officer corps in the German army in the late 30s was actually a big source of opposition to Hitler, albeit passive opposition. But Hitler's gambles kept working out, much to their surprise. I even remember reading one account from a German officer after the Western Allies allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland, where he expressed shock and condemned the Western Allies for not doing anything. How can you not do anything? That's the objectively stupid thing to do in this situation. And part of his grief was that he had been counting on the Western Allies applying more force, specifically so that Hitler and the Nazis would be more constrained, because he really didn't want to go and fight a war. So he saw that as a massive fuck up on the part of the West. A very insightful perspective, I think, given later events. So Germany, and I might add the Soviet Union, were relatively prepared for war, but their war preparations were not actually complete when World War II started, even for Germany. The Soviets, for their part, when Operation Barbarossa initiated in 1941, they were actually right in the middle of a massive reorganization of their army. And I've read accounts from analysts that say that if the German invasion had happened a year sooner or a year later, it would have gone much more poorly for them in the first year. But as was, it happened right in the middle of this reorganization. And in turn, the Soviet army was less prepared than it would have been if it had happened a year earlier or a year later, specifically for that reason. So the beginning of World War II actually kind of surprised everybody, including the Germans. It was not supposed to happen that early. So as a result, the war kind of initiated with both, I should say, the Eastern Front and the invasion of the Soviet Union, started with both armies being kind of like 75% prepared, so to speak. Just like roughly speaking. They were not like 100% strength. Now, while that was the case, the Germans still had a big advantage in terms of, one, the quality of their equipment, and two, the quality of their leadership. And the quality of their leadership was very high. If you know anything about the purges in the 1930s, you know that the Soviets killed a whole shit ton of their own people. And especially in the years leading up to World War II, the Soviet government kept itself busy basically murdering its entire officer corps. The Red Army's officers, pretty much from colonel on up in rank, were almost all killed during this period of the purges.
Why?
Yeah, they wiped out their senior leadership. They didn't trust them.
Huh.
They wanted to replace them with people they felt were more reliable. And mind you, a lot of these people were themselves Bolsheviks. That just wasn't enough. You know, there were a number of political battles that were fought for leadership of the Bolshevik Party in the 1920s. And while those battles had settled by the late 1930s, there were still a lot of grudges, and Stalin, of course, was very paranoid that other factions within the party might eventually turn against him. So he started killing his rivals, basically, in the mid-1930s on. And of course, one of the big things you have to be afraid about if you're in charge of an authoritarian government is, what if the army turns on you? Because they have a monopoly on violence. They're the ones who enforce your will. And if the enforcers turn on you, you're not really going to have another army to turn to in order to protect you. They are the army. So keeping them under control is a high priority. And Stalin, in this period when he was paranoid about potential rival poles of power in the party, made sure to go after the army too. And the result is that the army's senior leadership was almost completely wiped out. And that, of course, had dire consequences for the early years of the German invasion, because they basically had almost totally inexperienced officers having to learn how to fight in a modern war from scratch. Now, the Germans, by contrast, had basically been doing the polar opposite. They were supposed to, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, keep the size of their officer corps beneath a certain threshold, basically too small to realistically threaten anybody. But of course, they cheated. In fact, they started cheating on that even before the Nazis came to power. That was kind of a consensus position within the Weimar Republic government. We're going to cheat in this regard. It wasn't the only cheat that they did, but the Nazis were more known for cheating the treaty. Certainly, they were much more bold about it. But because of that, Germany, over the course of the 1920s, and then especially in the 1930s, was able to scale up its officer corps. And they were very well trained. And over the course of various conflicts in the 1930s, like the Spanish Civil War, they were able to get experienced. They were blooded. And then, of course, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany invaded Poland and then France. Also Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, etc. So they had significant direct combat experience in addition to indirect experience by way of the Spanish Civil War by the time they invaded the Soviet Union. Also, German doctrine was more advanced than the Soviets, which is ironic. One of the things that happened in the wake of World War I, once things had kind of settled down in Eastern Europe anyway, after a few years, the Germans secretly, again, wanted to continue to develop their doctrine, right? In addition to maintaining a large officer corps, which they were not supposed to do, they also wanted to try to train their officer corps in the newest, most modern doctrine. But they couldn't really do that in Germany without getting caught. So what they did is they signed a deal with another country to host their officers while they did this. And in exchange, those German officers would allow the officers of that partner country to join them in the exercises and to basically jointly develop the new doctrine that they were working on. So as you might guess, the doctrine that they eventually developed doing this is what became known as Blitzkrieg, which was kind of an early joint armed forces type thing, where they had both land and air forces working in tight coordination. It also involved significant innovation in terms of how to use mobile forces, so specifically tanks, which traditionally had been dispersed across the front line. But the Germans figured it would be better to concentrate them into a Schwerpunkt, the spearhead of an attack, punch through an enemy line, and then penetrate deep into their rear as quickly as possible in order to disrupt their logistics and command and control. As we'll see, in the early years of the Eastern Front, that was very effective. Now, there are two sort of catches here. One of them is just trivia. One, the Germans did not actually create Blitzkrieg. The idea of Blitzkrieg was actually originally innovated by a British academic who worked in the British Army, who published his ideas in the early mid-1920s. And the British themselves didn't really pay much attention to those ideas, but the Germans did, and they adapted them. So Blitzkrieg, interestingly, is actually originally a British idea that was refined by Germans. That's how a lot of innovation works throughout history, so maybe not surprising, but interesting bit of trivia anyway. Now, more relevant here, you can probably guess what the partner country was that the Germans worked with to develop this. It was the Soviet Union. It's a little counterintuitive. You'd think that the Soviets, being sort of ostracized in Europe as these radicals who can't be trusted and should be exorcised from the continent, would not find any reliable partners. But Germany at the time was desperate, and they didn't have a lot of other takers that they could kind of look to as being a potential partner. But the Soviets, because they were isolated, were a good choice, because nobody would even think that the Germans would try to do that. And also, because the exercises took place in the Soviet Union, they could take place away from prying eyes. The Soviets had big expanses of land that were sparsely populated. And because the Soviets were already a totalitarian state that didn't really have ties with any other countries, they didn't allow free movement of foreigners in the country, which made it even harder for potential spies to trip over the exercises. So the Germans, as a result, developed Blitzkrieg on the plains of the Soviet Union, specifically the Western Soviet Union, over the course of the 1920s in a series of secret exercises and war games. Again, very ironic given what happened later. Now, you'd think, since the Soviets participated in this, that the Soviets in turn would also have understood and incorporated Blitzkrieg doctrine into their army's doctrine. And they tried to, but it didn't end up working out. For one, the leading theoretician in the Soviet army was a guy named, I think his name was Tikachevsky, something to that effect. Anyway, they ended up killing him in the purges. So that obviously was a big setback. But also, there was a lot of resistance institutionally within the Red Army to fully embracing Blitzkrieg. And also, it was just difficult to adapt given that they just murdered all of the officers in the Corps over the course of the late 30s purges. So the Soviets actually were familiar with Blitzkrieg, but by the time the German invasion happened, they had not fully incorporated it into their army's doctrine. It was not something that was just well understood or that was inculcated amongst the officers in the army. So as a result, the Germans started the invasion with a big advantage in doctrine, despite the fact that the Soviets, if they'd been less murdery, should have been prepared for and would have been prepared for. So there's also, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sort of the non-aggression pact between Germany and the Soviets. But that's just going to kind of slow us down. Basically, just before the Germans invaded Poland, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and then part and parcel of that pact, a secret provision of that pact actually, was a secret division of Eastern Europe between them. So Poland was basically divided in half between the Soviets and Germany. The Soviets would get the Baltics. In exchange, Germany would actually get Memel back. That's a very thin sliver of territory. Basically, it's the western coast of present-day Lithuania, I want to say. It had been part of Germany before World War I, but then after the shenanigans of post-World War I Eastern Europe, it ended up being part of Lithuania, which the German nationalists didn't like. They wanted it back, so that was their demand in exchange for the rest of the Baltics. There was also a notion that the Russians would have a sphere of influence in the Balkans, but the details of that were never exactly worked out. And as I remember, the Soviets forcing Romania to give them Moldavia back was considered overreach by the Germans. That was not something that they had originally agreed to. And that was one of the things that kind of soured the relationship pretty early on. I don't know if Finland was discussed, but this is also the period in which the Soviets invaded Finland and tried to get it back and then failed. And the Germans, meanwhile, after successfully invading Poland, busied themselves invading, France, the Scandinavian countries, etc. So that gets you through 1940. And it was in this period that the Germans decided that they were definitely going to invade the Soviet Union. They didn't figure Britain would be a problem because, the British were isolated on their island. Their army had been devastated over the course of the fighting for France. And so the sense on the part of the Germans was that they could probably beat them just with an air offensive. And even if they couldn't, there just wasn't much the British could realistically do to threaten them and their hold on continental Europe. So the only other threat in Europe then was the Soviets. And as I discussed before, there was a sense amongst the German army's officers that the Soviets could probably be beaten relatively easily. The Soviets had performed poorly against the Finns. There was a sense that communists were bad at managing economies, and the Soviet economy was probably terrible. There was a number of different reasons why they thought the Soviets would basically be pushovers that could be defeated within the year. And so that led them to think that, hey, this would be a really good solution to our resource problem. The British have cut us off from trade with the rest of the world, on account of their control of the seas. And we do need more oil. In fact, one of the pressing issues facing the Germans from very early in the war was shortages of fuel and other resources. So invading the Soviets with their resource-rich territories, across Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus, that would be at least helpful in resolving that issue, if not solve it entirely. So invading the Soviet Union made sense from that perspective as well. That's sort of the Lebensraum perspective. And so they started planning for it. And they were originally going to invade earlier. I think it was going to be something like April or May 1941. But they ended up having to delay. Some of it was just difficulties mobilizing the army. They had to move everybody from France all the way to the other side of the continent. They also had shortages of trucks, which may surprise you. But I remind you again, German industry had not finished fully rearming yet, so they weren't quite ready for World War II. One of the ways that manifested was shortages of trucks and whatnot. So, and a lot of those were focused in specifically the mechanized divisions of the German army. Contrary to what you might expect, most of the German army was not mechanized over the course of World War II. The German army has a great reputation for being, fearsome and modern and whatnot, but actually it kind of wasn't. It was very well led, and they definitely had mechanized forces, tank divisions, tank armies even, the famous Panzergruppen. But most of the German army was horse and carriage. It was infantry, and it was supplied by horse and carriage, just like it had been decades before. And the Germans kind of knew that was a weakness, and so in the lead up to the invasion of the Soviet Union, they actually scoured Europe for trucks. They took people's trucks, confiscated them. There are famous stories from France of people losing their trucks because the Germans needed them for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Yeah. And the result then is that it delayed operations. They needed time to try to sort of collate all of these vehicles. And the other problem they had was Mussolini, because Mussolini and his government were adventurous who frequently got themselves into trouble. And the trouble they got into in 1940, late 1940, and then early 41, was an invasion of Greece. At this time, the country of Albania was an Italian colony. They had invaded it decades previous. And so in order to expand the Italian empire, Mussolini decided to invade Greece from Albania. And it went very poorly. So poorly, in fact, that the Greek army actually managed to force the Italian army out of Greece and then back into Albania. And they had even managed to push into Albania a few miles, if I remember correctly. So Mussolini kind of needed help, and he turned to Hitler to provide it. And the German government was kind of reluctant, but then there were other events in the Balkans that basically necessitated intervention there. Specifically, there was a coup in Yugoslavia. Before the coup, Yugoslavia had a pro-Axis government. But after the coup, it actually had a pro-Allied government. And of course, if you're Germany, that isn't going to work for you. So they kind of issued the usual diplomatic threats, and then they said, okay, that hasn't worked, so let's just invade Yugoslavia then and replace its government with a puppet government. And then that in turn will put us in position then to invade Greece and aid Italy. I would point out that they didn't just invade Greece because of Italy. They also wanted to deny Greece to the British, since that would be an obvious point at which they could potentially threaten the southern flank of the Axis powers of Europe. So the result, all told, of the invasion and conquest of Yugoslavia and Greece is that the invasion of the Soviet Union ended up being delayed by an additional month. So as a result, it did not actually happen until June 41, where before it had been planned for earlier. Now, the Soviets, meanwhile, kind of had a different set of difficulties. For one, they had just conquered a bunch of territory in Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Eastern Poland, Moldavia technically as well, although that wouldn't be as important later. Now, what this meant in practice is that the western frontier of the Soviet Union was pushed to the west by a couple hundred kilometers. And that was a problem because earlier, years before then, they had prepared for a war with Germany by building a huge set of fortifications across the Western Soviet Union that were famously called the Stalin Line. But when the frontier was pushed westward, they had to push their forces westward beyond the Stalin Line into territory that had not been fortified. And mind you, they had only took this territory in 1939. So they'd only had about a year and a half or so to try to fortify their positions there. And the Soviet economy was not such that they could really do that quickly. Again, most of their production was focused more on things like ammunition, tanks, planes, etc. The kind of equipment and resources you would need for fortification probably was available, but it was largely being directed elsewhere. And also, 2 years is just not as much time to fortify a frontier as they had with the Stalin Line, which they'd been continuously fortifying, I think, since the early 30s, if not earlier. So all told, when the Germans invaded, they were invading a territory that was not nearly as prepared in terms of defensive works as the line that had been developed further into the interior of the Soviet Union years earlier. Now, the other problem the Soviets had is that a lot of their equipment was not fully up to snuff. I mentioned the military reorganization earlier in the Soviet Union. Part of that involved developing and building newer equipment. For example, the famous T-34. They were in the process of building better equipment, but because the Germans invaded before they were able to finish that program of rearmament, a lot of the stuff that they started the war with was relatively archaic. You know, older warplanes from the 1920s and 30s, older tanks, etc. A lot of it just did not hold up against the more modern German stuff. And on top of that, the Soviets were not as good at logistics, so they were not as good at maintaining their equipment, either in the field or even in the rear. And in a lot of cases, they just didn't have a lot of replacement parts even in order to do it, even when they had the skill to do it. So that put them at a big disadvantage as well. I think a good chunk of their equipment just was not available, not because they didn't have it, but just because it had not been maintained and could not be used. So the pushing the frontier forward was a problem. The state of Soviet equipment was a problem. And of course, I already talked about the purges. So Soviet officers were not really up to snuff by that point, by the time the Germans invaded.
You would talk about that concept generally, about the trade-off between expertise and loyalty, and how if you have someone who's truly an expert, they'll oftentimes be more stubborn about, no, this is the correct move, and they don't follow your orders as well. So there can be a resistance there if you have a very autocratic leader who wants things done their way, and you have an expert who's saying, no, that's a dumb idea. Someone whose ego is very tender might get very upset by that sort of commentary, even if it's technically correct.
Yeah, that was the tension in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks were very, very concerned about being overthrown in a military coup. And so they preempted it. But the trade-off, of course, as you say, was that their military was much less prepared for the war when it eventually did happen.
You mentioned the trucks earlier, and I remember the quote that you've said where it's something like amateurs talk about strategy, enthusiasts talk about tactics.
Amateurs talk about strategy, aficionados talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics.
Mm-hmm. And logistics, that's trucks. That's why you need them.
That's trucks.
If you can't get your ass to the front line, you can't fight.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the problem that the Soviets had. They had tried to build up trucks. In fact, I was actually watching the Kings and Generals video, and one of them anyway, that they're doing on the lead up to the German invasion. And one of the things I learned that I hadn't known before is that the Soviets had tried to build up their inventory of trucks, but they just didn't have the equipment for it. You know, most of their resources were geared towards tractors because they had been trying to invest in and modernize their agriculture. And so as a result, the Soviet army didn't have as many trucks as it did have tracked vehicles, which had been developed and repurposed to act as impromptu trucks. Not quite as effective as actual trucks, but it was a sufficient sort of, what do you call it?
Stopgap?
Stopgap, that's the word I want, thank you.
What would they be like a tractor or something?
Yeah, basically just like a tractor, you know, like a tracked vehicle with tracks instead of wheels.
Oh, yeah.
But instead of being designed to do, you know, agricultural stuff like a combine or what have you, it would just be used to carry stuff like a regular truck would. Relatively sturdy since it's a tracked vehicle, but of course the trade-off is speed. They're relatively slow and also relatively expensive.
I was going to say fuel inefficient because they're probably heavy.
Okay, so that pretty much puts us on the eve of the invasion. The Soviets, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the Soviets knew an invasion was coming. A lot of people, for example, shit on Stalin because he received signs and he even received intelligence that the Germans were planning a war. But the criticism is that he didn't prepare for it enough. But if you actually sort of read the literature, they were preparing for war. They knew something was going to happen sooner or later. But the impression I got from my reading is that the Soviet government did not feel it was even remotely prepared for war in 1941. And it was very concerned that a war could pop off. And so it wanted to try to mitigate that possibility as much as possible so that if a war did start, it would start later when they were more prepared for it. So it's not necessarily the case that Stalin was delusional or just paranoid. There actually was like a legitimate reason to try to avoid war in 1941. But obviously that didn't happen. And it's not clear just what the response was in the immediate aftermath of the onset of the invasion, because Stalin famously disappeared for something like a week or two after the Germans actually did invade, because he thought they were thoroughly fucked. Let's see. I think that's most of the. Oh, right. I was going to talk about that. So, one of the things the Soviets did to prepare for war is that they mobilized conscripts. Obviously, their army had like a professional corps of guys. Officers. Well, some officers anyway. Obviously, they were all like new or one of the few who managed to survive the purges. But there was also NCOs and whatnot. So there was a small professional corps there. But really, there was a lot of conscripts. The army was filled out basically with conscripts, and they were mobilized in I want to say 39 and 40. And it was mostly these guys, rather than the professional corps of the army, that were deployed into the newly conquered territories in the Baltics and in eastern Poland. And so when the Germans did invade, they actually bore the brunt of it. So things went really badly for the Soviets in the first year of the war. And a big part of German success in the early onset was one, most of the units they were fighting on the frontier in the first couple months were just conscript units that had officers who had zero experience and very little training on account of the purges. And also their equipment was bad, poorly maintained, and a lot of their aircraft were actually just destroyed on the ground in the first week of the war, because of course the Germans launched the offensive with a big air attack that destroyed a lot of the air infrastructure in the immediate area near the German border. So, it would be like a very rough analogy, if you like. You play a lot of Dota. So I'll ask you, like, if you have an experienced team of Dota players on one team, and then the other team that they're playing against is people who have only played like a game or two and are still learning how to play, what's the result of that match going to be?
The new players are going to get completely destroyed, and they're not going to know what's going on.
Exactly. Right. They're just going to get steamrolled. And basically, that was the imbalance between the quality of leadership between the German army and the Soviet forces deployed in the Western Soviet Union when the war began. Like, they were just novices fighting against, battle-hardened dudes who had been fighting in Western Europe for more than a year already. So it wasn't just, they didn't lack for bravery. It's not like they didn't fight. But the issue is that they just didn't know what to do. They didn't know, like, the most effective way to do things. So they roughly knew that they knew how to use their weapons and stuff, obviously, but just in terms of tactics and strategy, that's where they were lacking. So, for example, neophyte officers who have been badly trained, if they're told to attack, they'll just attack. They'll tell their guys under their command to just go, charge at the enemy. And that's a dumb way to do it. Because if the opponent knows that there's if there's an avenue, a vector along which an opponent is most likely to attack, they'll fortify that. So if you just send your guys directly at the enemy, right into that kill zone, they're going to get annihilated. And a lot of novice officers in the early part of the war on the Soviet side made that mistake. They would just throw them in at the Germans, and the Germans would just chew them up. More experienced officers would know to take more indirect approaches during an attack. You would find, instead of like just crossing an open field or something, you would try to find a weak point in the defenses, or you would try to use terrain to your advantage to try to mask your movements and then surprise them. Stuff that's relatively more advanced in terms of tactics. That stuff was lost on a lot of the Soviet officers. They just didn't know any better at that point. And the result is that a whole bunch of Soviet infantrymen ended up dying basically for nothing. They ended up getting thrown away. A lot of the best resistance and strongest resistance on the part of the Soviets in the first month or two of the German invasion was more in the form of guerrilla fighters. And at that time, they didn't really have partisans like they would know them later, like guys operating behind enemy lines for long periods of time. The resistance early on was actually more just by soldiers who had been surrounded by the Germans or had otherwise been cut off from their units. Those guys who didn't just run away or surrender would continue to fight. And oftentimes they would find gaps in German lines that would allow them to evade the encirclement that had trapped them and continue fighting elsewhere. I've got a couple of stories like that. I can kind of tell them as we move along here. But roughly, again, I'm just trying to illustrate some of the factors here that influence the early fighting. So what about the actual fighting itself? What about the German invasion? Like, how did they plan this, roughly? So if you look at a map of the Eastern Front, it looks very intimidating because it's very large. In fact, I believe it's still the largest land war ever fought in the history of the human race. The theater was just that large. It was a huge scope of territory. So the Germans early on had the benefit of 4 Panzergruppen, and these are panzer armies. And these are large collections of panzer divisions that not only have large concentrations of tanks, but are also fully motorized. So everybody in these divisions, not just the tanks, but also the logistical corps, also the infantry, all had the benefit of trucks of one kind or another, or other mobile vehicles. And the result of that is that they could move very, very quickly. And these panzer armies were fairly large, which meant that wherever they attacked, they were almost always able to overwhelm whatever force was up against them. The Soviets just didn't have strong enough defensive fortifications at that point to deflect that kind of power. And when the Panzergruppen did penetrate a front line, again, as part of their doctrine, they would just keep going. They would not turn and flank other forces that were nearby. Rather, they wanted to penetrate as deeply behind enemy lines as possible, because that's where the roads and rail lines were that supplied the other forces near the front line. And that's also where the headquarters of the various units on the front line were located. Get rid of those and you could decapitate the leadership of the of the formations at the front line. And without leadership, of course, it's very difficult for them to coordinate, and that makes it much easier to defeat them. So you could cut them off from resupply and command and control, and that, of course, is debilitating in virtually any situation in war. So that was the purpose and focus of the Panzergruppen. And again, the Germans had 4 of them. So how do you assign them? What are the objectives? So what they ultimately did is they cut the Eastern Front into 3 sections. And these were correspondingly assigned 3 different army groups were assigned to these 3 different sections. One of them was Army Group North, which was roughly responsible for the Baltics and eventually Leningrad, as well as just northern Russia. Army Group Center was responsible for eastern Poland and then Belarus. And then Army Group South, which would be responsible for Moldavia, Ukraine, and then eventually southern Russia. Now, these different organizations, Army Groups North, Center, and South, they did coordinate with each other. The ultimate war plan was ultimately itself designed by OKH. I don't remember what that stands for, but OKH is basically German High Command. They were the war planners for the invasion, as well as just for the German military in general. For future reference, the Soviet equivalent of the OKH was Stavka. And if you read about the Eastern Front, you'll read quite a bit about the OKH and Stavka. So the OKH designed the invasion, Operation Barbarossa, but as far as the actual invasion plan for each, I think the individual commanders of the army groups had more input into that. Now, of the 4 Panzergruppen, 2 were assigned to Army Group Center. 1 was assigned to Army Group South, 1 to Army Group North. So basically, every front got 1 except for Army Group Center, which got 2. Army Group Center was seen as more important because their ultimate objective was Moscow. Army Group North, their ultimate objective was Leningrad, and then Army Group South, I think, was the Caucasus. I don't quite remember exactly, but I want to say it was the Caucasus. Now, the fact that the Germans set up their invasion this way, with the bulk of their forces in the center, was a big problem for the Soviets. Because the Soviets, again, thought that a war with the Germans was going to come, but their expectation is that if the Germans did invade, that most of their forces would be focused in the south, not in the center or north. And in turn, the bulk of Soviet military assets, such as they were at the time, were actually deployed into Western Ukraine and Moldavia. Eastern Poland and the Baltics, much more sparsely manned at that time. And so that's yet another reason why the Germans had so much success early in the war. A big chunk of the territory in the center and north was relatively thinly defended, in addition to being defended by conscripts that were basically just regular guys who hadn't really received much training, and officers who were relatively new at their job, having been promoted in the wake of the purges. And you can see this fact in that the German advance in the early months of the war was the fastest in Army Group Center and North. Army Group South, by contrast, actually experienced much more difficulty making progress. And this should itself kind of dispel one of the myths about the Red Army in World War II, which is that it was just totally incompetent and couldn't do anything. You know, a lot of people try to focus on Army Group Center and Army Group North and try to paint that as representative of the war on the Eastern Front, and it's actually not. The Germans had multiple big advantages in both those areas of the front. The part of the front where they did not have those advantages, again, that being in the south, is the part where they actually did struggle. They ultimately did win. You know, they obviously pushed the Red Army back eventually. And part of the reason the Red Army did better there is because of the terrain, not just because of their own efforts. But the fact that the Soviets actually had more of a fair fight there and fought better illustrates that they were not totally useless. Like, it was an actual army that could fight. They were just at a disadvantage in most parts of the front and suffered from bad leadership. So, that said, we can actually kind of start now. This was how the forces were arranged in the early part of the war. The Soviets had most of their forces in the south, relatively little in eastern Poland and the Baltics. Germans, most of their forces in western Poland, and relatively little in the south and the Balkans and in the north. So shit kicks off June 41. The Germans immediately go for encirclement operations. The Panzergruppen, the two Panzergruppen in the center, penetrate early, and they move deep into Belarus. And they connect actually to each other. That is to say, one Panzergruppen penetrates in the northern part of eastern Poland, and then the other Panzergruppen penetrates in the southern part of Poland. And they both push east, and eventually they meet together in western Belarus, I think it was. And in doing so, they encircle a huge chunk of Soviet forces in Belarus, most of them, in what was at that time called the Belastok Pocket. And that pocket, I think it was something like 1 to 200,000 Soviet troops were encircled there. And because they were encircled, they couldn't be reinforced, so they very quickly encountered problems with shortages of ammunition, both small arms and artillery. And they also had command and control problems in two forms. One, a number of their commanders had been cut off by the encirclement. And two, the orders they were getting from Stavka, you know, the high command, were a little bit schizophrenic. You know, they were telling them to just attack everywhere. And that was when they got orders at all. You know, in the opening hours of the war, Stavka basically just didn't tell them anything. And because a lot of officers were terrified of being killed on account of the purges, very few of them took any initiative. So a lot of people were just annihilated, sitting in their barracks, waiting for orders to do something. That was like the first couple days. Eventually they did get orders, but when they did get orders, it was just attack. And by that point, that was kind of redundant. They were already fighting. They were already on the defensive. So that wasn't really very useful. Stavka basically just didn't know what was happening on broad swaths of the front, and so their orders were not useful, just not helpful at all. So that was obviously very disorienting for commanders on the ground, and put them in a position where they had to risk their life by taking initiative, which most of them did not do, or follow orders to the letter, which meant just throwing their forces at the approaching Germans and getting annihilated. Now, like I mentioned before, Soviet forces being fully encircled like this did not mean that they were inevitably crushed. While the Germans were able to eventually defeat these forces, it actually took time. Because while the mobile forces, in the form of the Panzergruppen and also in terms of panzer divisions, was able to very quickly surround these groups, the work of actually reducing them and destroying them fell to slower moving infantry forces. And it actually took them a fair amount of time in order to catch up to the mobile forces and fill out the borders of the encirclement and eventually go on the offensive. And going on the offensive against the encircled forces itself took time. I think it took several more weeks, maybe a month, for the Białystok pocket to eventually be completely closed and destroyed. So obviously that creates delays for the Germans. It creates casualties and attrition for the Germans. It's a problem for them, even though it's a catastrophic blow for the Red Army. And even as they're destroying Soviet forces in this encirclement, and this is basically going to play out with other encirclements as well, even as they destroy these forces, many of them actually do escape. Because even though the Germans completely surround them, there's a lot of gaps in the German lines that allow Soviet troops on their own to sneak through. So of the original 100,000 or 200,000, again, I don't remember the exact number, Soviet forces that are surrounded in the Białystok pocket, I think something like half of them actually end up escaping. Now, they don't immediately rejoin the Red Army because, again, the situation on the ground is very fluid. Everything is very disorganized. But most of that half that escape end up finding their way eventually back to Soviet lines, whereupon they're reincorporated into the Red Army and put back on the front. So encirclements do not mean immediate death. They mean slow constriction over time that doesn't even ultimately destroy all of the forces within. Again, maybe around half of them escape, and then the other half either die or are taken prisoner.
I think in gaming we would call it a contain, where you set up outside of a territory to prevent them from leaving, but you don't necessarily commit to pushing into the territory.
Mm-hmm. Well, they do push into the territory. The encirclement is just meant to cut them off from resupply and to complicate command and control. But they do actually put pressure once they do encircle in order to try to reduce it and destroy the forces within. But of course, lacking ammunition and whatnot makes that very difficult. So eventually the Germans almost inevitably do win. But again, because the Soviet forces kept fighting despite the incredible odds, they delayed the German advance and attrited the German forces, both in terms of actual manpower losses and in terms of resources expended in the form of ammunition and fuel. Now, one of the big stories of this part of the front at this point of the war is what later became, I think, a hero city. There were a number of cities during the war that saw pitched battles and long protracted sieges against great odds. And these cities were, during and after the war, given the status of hero city of the Soviet Union. And one of them was the city of Brest-Litovsk. I don't think it was a big city, and it was very close to the border, so the Germans advanced on it very quickly. But the Soviet garrison within resisted for, I think, more than a month, even after they were surrounded. The city itself had a fort within it that the Soviets were able to utilize, and that's part of the reason they were able to hold out so long. But they had virtually no chance of success. Again, they were completely cut off and surrounded very early in the invasion, within the first couple of days, I think. And so no hope of resupply, no hope of relief, but they kept fighting anyway. Again, very patriotic people here. Even though they were conscripts, didn't know what to do, they still put forth their best effort. And so one of the heroic stories of the war for the Russians is hero cities like this holding out. And there was one particular guy, and if I'd prepared better for this, I would have his name for you. But there was one guy who was in this garrison who actually survived everybody else. One of the things the Germans did as they attacked the fortress is that they ran in, and once they were able to get past the earliest defenses, they were eventually able to restrict the Russians, well, I should say Soviets, the Soviet troops there, to basically a series of bunkers underneath the fort. And clearing that out was going to be just very difficult. And as infantry, you really don't want to do that. So what they did instead is they pumped a bunch of fuel into those bunkers and set it on fire and burned out the remaining defenders. And that was how they ultimately cleared the fort. However, there was one guy who managed to survive. And he actually continued fighting almost as a partisan, basically, within the bowels of the fortress for an additional several months. And in doing so, he survived on basically whatever rations he could steal from the Germans, whatever food he could get in the surrounding countryside, but otherwise he actually stayed within the fort, trying to kill and harass Germans as best he could while escaping detection. Yeah, ultimately, I think he ended up running out of food, and they eventually did just catch him and kill him. But his story did survive, and he ended up becoming a big hero.
Did he get a movie?
I don't think he got a movie. But you can at least read about him. So that was the situation in the central part of the front in the opening months of the war. In the north, it was even more of a cakewalk. Basically, the Germans pushed up against an open door. The Soviet defenses there were very weak and were thinly manned. And I don't think there were even any major battles or encirclements in the north, to my knowledge. As far as I know, the Panzer Group in there was able to spearhead deep into the north and make it all the way to Daugavpils. The biggest river in the Baltics is the River Dvina, and that was seen as the first big obstacle the Germans had to cross. You know, they needed to capture a crossing across the Dvina so that the Soviets would not end up turning that into a big defensive fortification. Because rivers are natural, sort of defensive lines. So if you can cross one quickly, that's ideal. And the Germans were actually able to do it. Their Panzergruppen was able to blitz from the German border all the way to the River Dvina in the Baltics in, I think, a week, maybe a little more or less, and secure a crossing at a town called Daugavpils. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, so I apologize. I don't speak Russian. But from there, they were able to immediately push on and start pressuring Leningrad. Or, for those of you who are maybe younger than me, the city of St. Petersburg used to be called Leningrad.
When did they
I think
change
most
it?
people... Huh?
When did they change it?
Collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it would have been the early 90s, sometime there. I think that was after, that was when they changed it from Leningrad back to St. Petersburg. They initially changed it, I think, during the Russian Civil War. So I want to say like early 1920s. And actually it was called Petrograd at that time. There was a lot of German phobia, whatever the word for that would be, basically anti-German sentiment in Russia because of World War I. And so during World War I, they actually changed the name from St. Petersburg to Petrograd, because St. Petersburg is a very German name. So Petrograd kind of Russified it. And so then, of course, during and after the revolution, they changed it again to Leningrad. I think most people listening to this are probably older, and so already knew that. You probably remember when it was still called Leningrad. But if we have any young folks listening who maybe are not familiar with the Soviet Union and its history, Leningrad is what they called St. Petersburg. So keep that in mind. So that said, yeah, Army Group North, having crossed the Dvina River, immediately just started pushing on Leningrad. They faced increasing resistance as they did so, not just from the Red Army, but also from the terrain itself. Because one of the things that distinguishes northern Russia from other parts of the front is that it's much more heavily forested. And that forestation is not very good for open tank warfare. Tanks need open land in order to really thrive. And they can still be useful even in, heavily vegetated spaces, but they're more road bound in that case. And being restricted to roads means it's easier to defend against you because they know where you're going to be. You're always going to be close to the road. Whereas if you're dealing with open countryside, like in most of the Russian front, in the center and south, in those cases, you don't necessarily know where the tanks are going to come from since they're not as road bound. So, Army Group North, Army Group Center, so that leaves Army Group South. Now, one of the separators between these fronts, specifically between Army Group Center and Army Group South, was a set of marshes called the Pripyat Marshes. And these are marshes that are mostly in sort of Belarus, more or less. I think we've talked before about peat production in Belarus, which they use to make fertilizer. A lot of that is extracted from marshes, and specifically the marsh in question, the Pripyat Marshes. Now, these marshes are relatively large, and they're sufficiently, marshy, difficult to pass, that the German army went out of their way to avoid the marshes. So Army Group Center basically went just north of the marsh, and Army Group South goes just south of it. So that's not entirely relevant right now, but it's going to be relevant a little bit later. So Army Group South pushes south of the Pripyat marshes into Ukraine from Romania, which was the main jumping off point for Army Group South. And the immediate problem they face, as I discussed before, is that most of the Red Army is already deployed there. So immediately they're facing a lot more resistance than the other army groups are. A bigger difficulty is the rivers in their area, because unlike in the other two fronts, there's a series of north-south rivers, not necessarily big, but decently sized, enough to be a problem for an army, that sort of cascade west to east. So there's the Bug River and I think a couple other ones. So because they have all of these north-south rivers in the way, the Soviets have an easier time defending against the German attack. And the Germans, meanwhile, have to take more time capturing crossings across these rivers, and then, of course, crossing them under fire, and then eventually getting a foothold on the other side, a bridgehead, so to speak, on the other side, and then expanding from there to the next river. So all of that slowed down the German advance significantly. In fact, it slowed down the German advance so much that Army Group Center to the north was able to expand way to the east, way faster to them. And the result is that there was a big salient that formed. Maybe not salient is the right word, but the southern flank of Army Group Center was exposed to the Soviets. They had successfully delayed the German advance for Army Group South enough that they had the possibility of attacking the flank of Army Group Center. And this was a big concern for German high command. Obviously, the commanders of the Panzergruppen didn't care about that. They wanted to take the initiative and push as deep and as fast as possible. But they received some pushback from higher command because they were worried specifically about that potential flanking attack from the Soviets. As was, they didn't actually have much to worry about because the Soviets were thoroughly tied down, either fighting Army Group South or were just too disorganized. Forces in the area were ordered to try something, but it was just too chaotic and too disorganized to really amount to anything. And also the Pripyat marshes were in the way anyway, so that kind of limited mobility of Soviet forces in the area. I actually remember a story, come to think of it, of a Soviet tank commander who had a significant, I think it was like a brigade, an armored brigade under his command, and he was supposed to attack the Germans to try to relieve pressure on Soviet forces fighting Army Group Center. And on the way to attack the Germans, he accidentally drove his unit into a marsh.
Oh, no.
All of them, yeah. So obviously that is a pretty colossal fuck up, especially at a critical moment in the war. And given how unforgiving the Soviets were, especially at that time, you can maybe understand what he did next, which was to unceremoniously kill himself on the spot.
Wow.
Now, I would point out that ideally your officers would be allowed an opportunity to learn from their mistakes so that they could improve over time. But that was not really what was done then. Either intentionally or unintentionally, the expectation was that if you made a mistake at all, then you were screwed. You would either be sent to jail as a class enemy or just executed outright by the NKVD, the secret police of the Soviet Union. So in turn, one of the many things that Soviet leaders suffered from, again, these are officers leading men on the ground, they very rarely wanted to take initiative because they were just so scared of the consequences of a failure. If they did anything, it had to be because of a direct order, specifically to do something. And they very frequently observed the very letter of that order. They did not venture far from it at all. Now, the Germans, by contrast, had a very open command style. They actually encouraged subordinates to take the initiative and seize opportunities when they presented themselves. And correspondingly, German officers sometimes went off on wild adventures that their commanders had never envisioned, but as a result of which they achieved big victories. The Soviets did not enjoy that advantage, and in turn, they suffered, especially early in the war.
So the difference is basically Soviet style. If you go on a finite adventure and be like, hey, this seemed like a really good plan, you go to a place worse than jail now. German style, you go off on an adventure, they're like, good luck, bro. That seems like a good idea.
I would also point out that they had more. Well, the Soviet style was give an order, expect it to be followed to the letter, and have the order be very, very detailed and specific. That was how you gave orders to subordinates. The German style was to give objectives. Rather than telling your subordinates specifically what to do, you would tell them what you wanted them to end up with. The objective is X. How you get X, totally up to you. So it was a much more decentralized command style, as well as being one that encouraged risk. Okay, so we're in the first couple months of the war now. I think one of the battles here, and this is actually a battle I don't know a lot about. This is still something I need to read about. It's the Battle of Brody, I believe is the name. And this is a battle that's pretty obscure for me, because I'd never really even heard of it until a couple of years ago. But I should have known about it, because it is actually, technically, the largest tank battle of World War II. Generally, that title goes to the Battle of Kursk, which hopefully we'll get to a little bit later. But apparently, the title actually belongs to this obscure battle in the first year of the war, the Battle of Brody. I would point out here that even though Soviet tank equipment was inferior to Western equivalents and very frequently poorly maintained, that's not to say they did not have a lot of it. They had produced a whole bunch of stuff over the course of the 1930s. In fact, technically, they had more tanks than the Germans did. I think they also had more aircraft, but again, most of those were destroyed on the ground in the first offensive of the war. But in terms of tanks, there was actually a quantitative advantage. The trouble, of course, was, as we've discussed, Soviet officers didn't really know how to use them. And so very frequently they ended up getting outplayed by their German equivalents. And this is despite some of them enjoying the T-34, which was unmatched in the early part of the war. It was an excellent tank, very good armor, etc. Not sure where I was going with that. I think I got off on a tangent.
The biggest tank battle of the war was
biggest tank battle. Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, I think this was in Western Ukraine. And I think one of the Panzergruppen basically encountered a large unit of Soviet armor that just happened to be garrisoned in the area. They received orders to attack. They did. They did it in just sort of prototypical neophyte style, just kind of throwing their resources at the enemy. And the Germans in turn met them and eventually outmaneuvered and defeated them. So it was not like a big dramatic battle like Kursk was. This battle was much more one-sided. The German tanks were just higher quality. The German commanders were able to just very easily outmaneuver the much less experienced Soviet crews that they fought against. But just in terms of sheer numbers, there were just so many Soviet tanks and German tanks on the field at the same time, because both sides were just throwing resources at each other, that this is actually the largest tank battle of the war. As you can imagine, the Soviets took just grievous losses. It was very lopsided. At this point, they just didn't have the resources and didn't have the leadership for it to happen otherwise. But the Germans, for their part, were at the height of their power in the first year of the war. This is when they had the most resources available to their army, both in terms of manpower and fuel and ammunition and vehicles. And the Soviets, for their part, still have their vast inventory left over from the 1930s. And so the combination of these two factors resulted in this huge-ass battle that was, despite its size, incredibly lopsided. I think it would get more attention if it had not been so lopsided. But as was, it was just such a German, I don't want to say walkover, but just such a clean-cut German victory that it doesn't receive that much. It was just basically part and parcel of a broader set of German victories that were all happening all along the front at the same time period.
Is this the battle that the game World of Tanks was based off of?
That's good. That's very good. I like the levels of that. Yeah, the World of Tanks could be considered a pretty good simulacrum of the fighting that we're talking about. Okay, so this is the first couple months. So where do we go from here? Okay, Army Group Center has surrounded Soviet forces in eastern Poland. They've reached western Belarus. The Belostok pocket still exists at this point, but is in the process of being reduced by slower moving German infantry that have moved up behind the panzer armies. So from here, there's a big push into Belarus, and specifically the target here is the city of Minsk, the largest, well, yeah, I think actually they might have reached Minsk already. I don't quite remember the order. It's been too long. Well, regardless, I think they do push on Minsk and eventually succeed in taking it, but I think this gets wrapped into the broader Battle of Smolensk. And this is an important juncture of the war, because this is the first time the Germans experience significant losses. They don't lose the Battle of Smolensk, but they do take sufficient attrition that they have to stop the advance for a while. And that was a kind of strategic victory in its own right at this point, because obviously the Soviet strategy here is to just delay the Germans as much as possible until they can reconstitute better equipped, better trained forces further east. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the Battle of Smolensk and the fighting for Belarus and Minsk, because obviously I don't quite remember the proper sequence of events there. I think there might have been another pocket, but I don't quite remember. Regardless, the Battle of Smolensk is strategically significant for the reasons described. However, it's also relevant because there is a huge debate that broke out in the German army at that time around what to do after the Battle of Smolensk. And debate about the decision made herein has sort of echoed throughout the ages since then. Military historians and armchair generals still argue about this to this day. So I'm going to let you in on it here. So after the Battle of Smolensk, the next obvious target is Moscow. And the leaders of the German armies in Belarus at that time, after the Battle of Smolensk, very badly want to launch an offensive at Moscow. And their logic is that there's never going to be a time again when the defenses of Moscow are going to be weaker, because they've already cut through big swaths of the Red Army, and the Red Army is reeling, and obviously they're having to come up with defenses on the fly wherever the Germans go. So if they push now, they'll have a much easier time than if they wait later, when the Red Army will have had time to fortify the areas around Moscow. So this is their thinking. However, there's an alternative opinion, which is that, one, the German forces that have pushed into Belarus have been not quite gutted, but have been bled white by the fighting in the Battle of Smolensk and need time to refuel, rearm, etc. Furthermore, the army at that point in Army Group Center had advanced so far ahead of Army Group South that its southern flank was now even more extended and vulnerable than it was months ago. And there had actually already been, finally, a significant Soviet attack attacking that flank a few weeks earlier at a place called Yelnya. Did not succeed, but it did succeed in scaring German high command. And they'd already been concerned about something like that happening. Fun trivia for you, the Soviet counterattack at Yelnya was led by General Zhukov. And it was actually partly because of that battle that he was promoted and ended up becoming the main Soviet general for World War II. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's easily the most famous Soviet general of the war.
What made him famous?
One, he was experienced, unlike most of the officers at the time. Two, Battle of Yelnya. And I think also he had Stalin's trust, because he kind of knew how to manage Stalin, unlike a lot of guys. Most people were too afraid to give Stalin bad news or to criticize Stalin's plans. Mm-hmm. Zhukov was one of the few guys that could do that and get away with it. And Stalin actually did see value in that.
What was his method for not being killed for it?
Very careful rhetoric. You don't criticize the dear leader directly, but you do kind of criticize him indirectly. You kind of beat around the bush. We could do that, but there's a couple of problems we have to sort out first. And some of the ways we could sort those out are by doing things completely differently.
That sounds like what Kukya would do. He was really clever like that, where you basically judo someone in a conversation into agreeing with you, and at the end of it, they think that they thought of it. And one of the tricky things about this is you have to kind of set aside your own ego to allow them to feel like they're the smart one in the room, when really maybe they started with a really bad plan, and you're like, what if there was another route that we went about this, and you sort of steer them rather than just tell them. Because if you have someone who's a megalomaniac like Stalin, and you tell him like, no, that's going to fail, then he's like, okay, well, you die now. But if you try to lead him in a direction where he feels like he's really smart and that his plan can be improved, like you're saying, if you take care of these things first, then he'll think that it was really a good conversation. So it's an indirect approach rather than a direct approach.
Yeah. A very useful skill in a totalitarian society.
Yeah.
So Zhukov, he could kind of sweet talk him, and he kind of got into his good graces on that count.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was part of a small class of officers who had actually fought in the Tsarist army way back in the day, who had managed to survive all the way up to World War II, and ended up getting promoted and working their way up the ranks. One of the other guys in that vein was a guy named Mikhail Rokossovsky, I believe. He's another guy that would go on to become a famous general during the war because of his exploits. And his story is even more dramatic because he had actually not survived the purges. He had actually, just before the war started, been identified for execution. And the NKVD had arrested him, was torturing him, and was planning to kill him when the invasion started. And it was at that point that they actually asked him to join the Red Army again and help them fight the Germans.
I know we're torturing you right now, but what if we offered you a job?
He said yes. Not much of a choice in the grand scheme of things,
Better
but
than
he is
being
known.
tortured,
Yeah, he is known for having been a patriot. He didn't have to. He could have said, "Hey, fuck all y'all," but he didn't. Another fun fact there: he actually started the war after he was released with no fingernails, for obvious reasons. Okay, so... Oh, right, Smolensk. Okay, so the commanders on the ground wanted to push on to Moscow. German high command was afraid that they were going to attack on their southern flank because they had way gotten ahead of Army Group South. And the Russians were just all along that southern flank ready to go, hypothetically. So high command wanted them to just pause and to sit there and reconstitute their forces in order to prepare for a push later on. So there was a big debate about this, and to this day, people debate what would have happened if the German commanders had been given their way, because ultimately they were not. German high command ultimately told them not to push on Moscow at that point. Hypothetically, it's true that they could have faced less resistance than they would have later, that they did later, when they eventually did push on Moscow. However, that said, the German forces themselves pushing on Moscow at that point were much weaker than they would be later. So it's not entirely clear it would have worked out for them. And that long southern flank was only going to get more vulnerable the further east they pushed. And they'd already been gutted once fighting at Smolensk and the surrounding area. So one of the big hypotheticals of World War II, just right there. Instead of doing that, what OKH told them to do instead was almost a kind of compromise. They would split the two Panzer Group in Army Group Center. The rest of Army Group Center beyond the tank armies would just hold the territory they'd taken and rebuild their forces, and also clear out the encircled Soviets that they'd encircled over the course of the past few months. One Panzer Group rather, would be sent north, and the other one would be sent south. Now, the reason they were sending one north is because of events on Army Group North at that point, which I haven't gotten to yet. But basically, Army Group North, after it crossed the River Dvina, managed to successfully reach the area around Leningrad. But they had been stopped there. Now, I think the original plan had been to starve out the city rather than take it. So I don't know that they actually stormed the city when they finally reached it. I think they were planning on just surrounding it and then leaving it. But I think eventually they did decide to make serious pushes on it because the Soviets had been successfully able to continue to get resources into the city, despite the fact that it was under siege. I would point out here that this is actually where Finland becomes relevant, because like I said earlier, Finland actually joined the war on the side of Nazi Germany, and they did participate in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Finland's main objective was to reconquer the territory they had lost in the Winter War. And some of that was pretty close to St. Petersburg, Leningrad rather. It was actually on sort of this narrow isthmus between the Baltic Sea and Lake Ladoga. The Finns were able to take that back relatively quickly. And afterwards, they were pretty content not to engage in further offensive operations. That is part of the reason the Soviets later on went easy on them after the war. The Finns could have tried to substantively contribute to further offensive operations in the Soviet Union once they reconquered their old territory. As was, they did not. They took their territory and then they mostly just sat on it and waited for the war to end. The Germans didn't like that. They were not pleased, but there also wasn't much they could do about it. They were pretty stretched thin as it was. Again, largest land conflict in history. And, the Germans were having to leverage everything they had in order to cover all of that ground. And, accounting for Army Group Center, North, and South, they really didn't have a lot left over for Finland. Keep in mind, Finland has a large border with Russia. And there were some offensive operations along the Finno-Soviet border during the course of the war. But the logistics of the area were relatively poor. I should say the infrastructure of the area was relatively poor, which made it difficult to sustain large units in that area. And so ultimately, the Finno-Soviet border, while it did see some conflict, and I think one or two attempts by the Germans to try to push into Karelia, that is to say, the Soviet side of that border, ultimately that ended up being a relatively quiet front, which was actually fortunate for the Soviets, because one of their links to the West, in the form of Lend-Lease, actually ran through the port of Murmansk. The Soviets had built a railroad connecting the port of Murmansk south down to the rest of the country, and a good chunk of Lend-Lease equipment that was brought by ship through that area, through the Arctic, did make landfall at Murmansk and unload there. I hope I'm not mixing up Murmansk and Archangels. I might be. I apologize if so. But there was a port up there that would have been cut off from the rest of the country if the Germans had successfully pushed east from Finland into that part of the Soviet Union, but it never happened, fortunately for the Soviets. But more relevant for the discussion here on Army Group North, the Finns did not help the Germans push on Leningrad. Once they'd taken back their territory on that isthmus, that was pretty much it for them, and most of the German efforts to take the city after that were German-only initiatives. Now, like I said, they did not immediately push on the city. They were hoping to just starve it out. But what the Soviets did is they managed to maintain one rail link to the city in these early months. And that rail link is how they managed to keep people fed, keep units armed, etc. And that would last a couple more months. I think around October, the Germans did finally manage to cut it, but that's getting a little ahead of myself. We'll get to that in a minute. I guess I need to pick up the pace here. We're still in 1941. So what happened is that after a while, the Germans did decide to actually just attack the city and try to take it. And so that's where Army Group Center's Panzergruppen comes in, or at least one of the two. The reason they sent one of them to the north is to specifically help with the offensive on Leningrad that they were planning at that point in 1941. Now, Army Group South, in contrast, had a different objective. Like I mentioned before, Army Group South was dragging behind the other two army groups in terms of the territory they'd taken. They were still kind of stuck in western Ukraine by this point. And so one of the panzer groups from Army Group Center was tasked with pushing south and trying to flank Soviet forces in western Ukraine from the rear. And they would do that by ultimately pushing on Kiev directly. And this set the stage for one of the big disasters for the Allies during World War II, that being the Battle of Kiev. So as this Panzergruppen pushed south, the Soviets very quickly realized they were in trouble, and they started withdrawing back towards the Dnieper River, which is that main big river that runs through the middle of Ukraine, on which sits the city of Kiev. So German forces from the west advanced at the same time that the Panzergruppen advanced south. Soviet forces started to consolidate in the center of Ukraine, specifically around Kiev in particular. Now, the Soviet commander here was an old guy named, I believe it was Vorozhilov. And he was an old veteran from the Russian Civil War. He was not good at war. It was a low-quality commander. And the only reason he had his commission was because he was on close personal terms with Joseph Stalin. He was a crony, he was reliable politically, and in turn, he was given a very high rank in the Red Army, which was very unfortunate for his men because, again, he did not know what he was doing. He was basically fighting a battle from World War I. He expected the Germans to focus directly on the city of Kiev, and that if he fortified the environs around the city, that he would basically force a decisive battle in which he could slow, if not stop outright, the German advance. He did not account for the fact that the Panzer Army that was descending from Belarus could just go around him, which is what happened. The Panzergruppen did not advance directly on Kiev. Instead, it went to the east of Kiev. And combined with German forces advancing from the west, they completely surrounded and cut off the city. Mind you, almost the entirety of the Soviet Red Army in the south at this point was in and around Kiev. And so now it has been completely cut off. And this commander, Voroshilov, rather than thinking, oh, I fucked up big, we're going to have to fight here and try to drag out this battle as long as possible so that the Red Army has time to reconstitute forces to the east in order to build new defenses. Instead of doing that, he just says, oh, well, I got outmaneuvered. Oh, well, it's time to surrender. And he does. He fights for a couple weeks, but it's pretty clear it's not going to happen, right? He's not going to win this battle. He's cut off, no resupply, no relief. And so he surrenders the entire garrison around Kiev. And how many people is that, Neuro? 660,000 troops.
Wow, that's a big surrender.
That's a big surrender, is putting it mildly. It was a massive disaster for the Red Army. And the Germans, for their part, firmly believed that this was the killing blow. A lot of people thought that this was the decisive battle they'd been seeking, and that having destroyed such a large chunk of the Red Army, surely the Red Army would be crippled, and that the end of the war was now a formality. They ended up being wrong for a variety of reasons. But just to kind of conclude this, having surrounded Kiev, German forces also moved south towards Crimea and southern Ukraine. In doing so, they surrounded but failed to take the port city of Odessa in southern Ukraine.
It's fun hearing this because we have recently talked about the Ukraine war, so hearing the same cities fought over, you can almost visualize an old-timey version of it.
Yeah, but that's basically what it was. Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, the Germans not only surrounded Odessa, they also pushed into Crimea and surrounded Sevastopol. And for those who don't know, Sevastopol is on the southwestern, roughly, tip of Crimea, and it's the main Russian naval base in the Black Sea. So obviously that's going to be very fortified, lots of troops there, etc. And the Germans were not able to take Sevastopol immediately. Instead, thus began the sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol, which would last for a very long time. Odessa would last a couple months, actually. A successful defense, well, ultimately a failed defense, but a heroic defense, shall we say, that earned the city of Odessa hero status. It was one of the hero cities of the Soviet Union. Sevastopol also was awarded status as a hero city of the Soviet Union. And in their case, they actually lasted even longer than Odessa. I believe it was something like 6 months. In fact, I think they lasted into 1942, maybe? I want to say they lasted into 42, but I could be mistaken there. Anyway, to skip ahead a little bit, the Germans ultimately could not successfully storm the fortifications there, so they actually did the same thing they did in Brest-Litovsk, which is to get the outer reaches of the fort and then flood the fort with gasoline that they then set on fire, incinerating the defenders. I think they also used gas for that. World War II is not known for chemical warfare, but I think breaking the siege of Sevastopol, ending that siege, I think did actually involve some chemical warfare on the part of the Germans. But it's been too long since I've read about it, so I can't clearly remember. Anyway, Kiev was a big disaster. The Germans thought that they'd crippled the Red Army and that the war was all but over. And they were basically wrong for two reasons. One of the big strengths the Red Army had, even at this juncture in the war when they were getting slapped around, is that they were very, very good at creating new units. Mobilization was a key strength for them. They were able not only to mobilize people from the civilian populace, but also to take people who had escaped encirclement and also from other units and piece them together into sort of these impromptu rifle divisions. And because they were just rifle divisions with very little in the way of supporting heavy equipment like artillery, trucks, what have you, these could be created pretty quickly and cheaply. And this they did. So very frequently over the course of the war, the Germans would advance, destroy large numbers of Soviet units, and then would penetrate further inland, thinking they had nothing further to fear, only to run smack into fresh Soviet divisions that they hadn't even known existed, and that very frequently had just been formed over the course of the previous month. So that's one way that the Soviets were able to evade terrible fallout, even in spite of awful disasters like the Battle of Kiev. The other issue is that German intelligence over the course of the war was pretty bad, if not catastrophically bad. German intelligence before the war did not know about Soviet industrialization. They knew they were trying, but they had no idea the extent of it. And Hitler himself is actually on a recording talking to the leader of Finland later in the war, saying that if he'd known that Soviet tank production was as high as it was, that he would not have invaded the Soviet Union. So lots of failures there in terms of understanding how strong the opponent was, but also terrible in terms of just field intelligence. The Germans were able to get a rough idea of where the Soviets were, but very frequently they struggled to understand how well the Soviets were coping with their losses and reconstituting new ones. I would point out that German intelligence, in terms of tactical intelligence, was actually pretty good, but that had more to do with bad practices by Soviet soldiers. For example, one of their problems early in the war is a lack of operational security. For example, Soviet soldiers would very frequently try to communicate with each other, and this is something even Soviet commanders would do. They would communicate with their subordinates over unsecure radio channels, which of course the Germans would listen to. So
dude, this is the same as them using Facebook and shit in Ukraine.
Yeah, very similar. It's the same kind of mistake.
That's funny.
And so that gave the Germans another advantage. You know, they already had plenty at a tactical level. Okay, so we're pretty much I think this brings us to roughly August, September 1941. In Army Group North, the Panzergruppen from Army Group Center moves north. They fight inconclusive fighting. I think over the course of the subsequent month, they do successfully cut off that rail connection that had been connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. I think they took a city called Tikhvin that had been a big rail junction. So at that point, the siege of Leningrad really begins in earnest. And you really can't talk about the Eastern Front without talking about the siege of Leningrad, because it is one of the big dramas of the conflict. Having already been under siege, the city had already been significantly damaged by German artillery, aerial attack, etc. But the city had managed to withstand all of the German attacks, partly because it was such a small area. You know, when the Germans had a broad area to fight in, they could outmaneuver an enemy. But in the northern regions that Leningrad sat in, the terrain basically funneled you into Leningrad. And so that meant that the Soviets did not have to defend nearly as much territory. And the Germans did not have the ability to take advantage of their superior maneuverability. It was basically a static battle of static defenses. And the Soviets were able to leverage that to their advantage to offset the multitude of other advantages that the Germans had. Also, very short supply lines. The city of Leningrad was one of the industrial centers of the Soviet Union, and they had a number of factories there that produced stuff for the Red Army, including guns. And contrary to what you might expect, despite the fact that the city was mostly cut off, for most of the siege, the Soviets were able to get war material to the factories there, and they actually continued to produce during the siege. And because the factories themselves were not more than a few miles from the front line, weapons and ammunition produced in them did not have to travel far to resupply units on the front line. Those frontline units were basically fighting directly in front of the factories supplying them. In fact, I remember one account of a weapon that was produced only in Leningrad during the war. As you might imagine, while they were still able to source Leningrad's factories, there were frequently times when there were shortages. So in response to that, some engineers in Leningrad designed a new type of submachine gun that required fewer parts. And so that was a Leningrad-specific rifle produced specifically for soldiers fighting immediately around the city. Yeah, the Soviets also had a small navy in the Baltic Sea at the start of the war, and obviously they were largely restricted to port on account of German U-boat activity as well as activity by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. But while in port, they were relatively well defended by strong air defenses, as well as air defenses on the ships themselves. And the larger ships, including, I think, 1 or 2 battleships, actually provided support to the infantry fighting around the city by providing indirect fire. Basically, the big guns on the ships acted as artillery that provided artillery support. That's just how close the fighting was to the city at that point. Let's see, there's a lot of human interest stories that kind of spin out from this period, but I don't really have time to focus on them. But as you might guess, food shortages were a big problem, and in turn, lots and lots of people died in the city. The authorities tried to prioritize soldiers and workers in terms of rations. So if you were not working in a factory or fighting on the front line, you were probably not getting enough to eat during the height of the siege. And it was specifically in the latter part of 1941 that the siege was at its worst, because again, the rail line had been cut. So what ended up happening is that the Soviets had to resort to getting resources to Leningrad across Lake Ladoga. If you look at a map of the area, you can see a big lake to the east of Leningrad / St. Petersburg. And some resources could cross by barge, but eventually the lake froze over. And when it did, the Soviets actually tried to cross the lake by truck with supplies for the city. And that was extremely dangerous, as you might expect, because the ice was not always very thick. So at any moment while you're driving across this lake, your truck could fall through. And there's actually pictures of these trucks driving across the lake with their drivers hanging out of the truck, right? They're standing instead of sitting in the truck with the door open, ready to jump out the second anything happens.
In case it cracks and falls in. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
In case it cracks and falls in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nobody wants to die that way. That's pretty terrifying. And the whole time these trucks are crossing the lake, in addition to worrying about the ice, they're also getting shot at. Because, of course, the Luftwaffe is bombarding the lake, trying to prevent resupply of Leningrad. And German artillery also is occasionally trying to hit them. So while you're crossing the lake on these trucks across the frozen ice, the ice is periodically exploding because of artillery and airstrikes.
Exciting.
Very much so. Now, unfortunately, even with all of that happening, there still wasn't enough food getting in. So there are lots and lots of accounts of civilians starving to death in the city at that time. I think one of the first-hand accounts I remember reading was that you would just be walking to work, going about your business, and every day you would see new bodies on the street. You wouldn't know who they were. All you really knew about them is that they had most likely just starved to death and run out of energy and collapsed on the street. And it just became very despairingly common for people to see that over the course of the siege. Keep in mind, this is technically one of the great cities of Europe, so this is not like some mid-tier city of just like 50,000 people, 100,000 people. This is a city that had several 100,000 people in it, if not more. So there was a large civilian population there, and they suffered very grievously during this period. I think another account I remember is that there was so little food that people started pulling down wallpaper because they wanted to extract the glue that the wallpaper had been attached to the wall with, because that glue actually had some animal fat as part of its ingredients, and they wanted to consume that for calories. Yeah, hunger will make you crazy. People will get very, very desperate when they get very hungry, so no surprise. So again, lots of tragic stories in this vein. If you want to read about the Siege of Leningrad, I encourage you to. It's one of the big stories of the war. There's lots of literature on it. So let's see. I think beyond that, though, the city basically, long story short, managed to hold out against all odds. I think at one point later in 41, there was an offensive, a German offensive, that was designed to end the siege. This is after, the Panzergruppen from Belarus had moved up. But they ended up running right smack into a Soviet offensive that had been just coincidentally timed for the exact same time, that was similarly intended to lift the siege by pushing the Germans away from the city. And so basically the offensives canceled each other out. Yeah, that might have been early 42 instead of late 41. I don't quite remember, but I think that was the last major attempt by either side to really lift the siege. That wasn't even the last time that would happen. There was one or two other times when Soviet and German offensives in the same area just happened to be timed at the same time and then just collided with each other. So let's see. That's Army Group North in late 41. German forces in late 41, after August, September, were mostly focused in Army Group Center. So Army Group North didn't really receive a lot of resupply, and that kind of became a pattern later. Army Group North would really never again be the recipient of a lot of support from German high command. That part of the front became relatively low priority, and so a holding pattern resulted. I think eventually in around October or November, actually it would have been later, it probably would have been around December, the Soviets were able to take back Tikhvin. And again, that's the rail junction through which the Leningrad had been connected to the outside world, the Soviet Union. So once the Red Army had liberated Tikhvin, they were able to reopen that rail line and get a lot more food supplies and whatnot to the civilian population, as well as military supplies to the defenders around the city. The siege of Leningrad would continue after that, but it would never be as bad again as it was in late 41, when the city was almost completely isolated. I think the siege of Leningrad would not end until, I want to say, like early 1944. So in the intervening years, the city was basically almost under continuous bombardment by artillery and German air power. Now let's see. I'm going to skip Army Group Center for now because that's going to be a big deal. But in Army Group South, after they'd taken Kiev and were in the process of reducing Odessa and Sevastopol, they started pushing on Rostov, which is the city that's kind of at the crux of Ukraine and Russia in the region, the sort of Kuban region. I guess another way to put it is that it's sort of at the delta of the Don River. Yeah, roughly speaking, northeast of Crimea, let's put it like that. So the German forces pushed into that, and once they took the city, they started to push into the Caucasus. But by then, it was around December, and they ended up getting pushed back in the subsequent December counteroffensive, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. Basically, Army Group Center then focused on Moscow, and they just went all in. Basically, most of what Germany had to offer at that point was redirected to Moscow. So Army Group Center, again, had two panzer groups, and then one panzer group from the south was redirected north and pushed towards Moscow from the southwest. And the immediate result of this was the Vyazma pocket. Basically, they surrounded a large contingent of Soviet troops to the west of Moscow. And from there, the Soviets were kind of in trouble because they'd been hoping that would kind of delay or stop the Germans. It did not. And so they had to create a new defensive line at Mozhaysk, which was even closer to Moscow. And by this point, Moscow was in the process of being evacuated. They were not supposed to evacuate. The Soviet government was actually telling people to stay put. But by this point, it really looked all the world like the Soviet government was about to fall. And so a lot of people, even in a totalitarian state, in such circumstances will jump ship. And so Moscow emptied out accordingly. Even so, Stalin decided to stay. He figured he'd see it through. He would probably be dead either way. And tasked General Zhukov with the defense of the city. And it was at this point, really, where Stalin really finally took a hands-off approach to commanding. He had been very much a micromanager up until this point in the war. But here, he basically took a hands-off approach and told General Zhukov to do whatever he thought necessary in order to defend the capital of the Soviet Union. And Zhukov was able to successfully defend the city, although it was by the barest of margins. By the time the Germans started approaching the city, in fact, I think there was one reconnaissance unit that could actually see St. Basil's Cathedral. By that time, it was getting cold, like very, very cold. I forgot to talk about Rasputitsa. I should have earlier. That was Rasputitsa, for those who don't know, is a seasonal event in the region wherein it basically rains and turns the whole area into a big, giant mud pit. And as you can imagine, all of that mud makes it very difficult to conduct operations. Russian roads were also very low quality in much of the Soviet Union. So when Rasputitsa hit, it was almost impossible to traverse the terrain, especially if you're an armored, mechanized army, like the most advanced units of the German army were. So Rasputitsa actually served to buy the Soviets a lot of time, starting around October, November. And the Germans, for their part, had to wait until the end of that to launch their final offensive on Moscow. So that gave them a little bit of time. But beyond that, once the battle for Moscow really started in earnest, Vyazma was a collapse, but they were able to successfully hold because of winter, because of the cold weather. The Germans basically just ran out of steam. And it wasn't just the cold weather, it was also the accumulated attrition of about 5-6 months of like intensive warfare in the Eastern Front. I would point out that the German army was actually pretty tired, if not exhausted, after the invasion of France. They were able to win, but they were very tired. Like their forces had been stretched to the limit, their available resources had been stretched to the limit. And the size of the territory they took over the course of the battle for France was way smaller than the size of the territory of the Eastern Front. The field of combat on the Eastern Front was just many times larger than that. And they didn't have that many more resources for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So by the time you get to December 41, the German army is absolutely exhausted. They've basically run out of fuel, run out of ammo. And more to the point, they were not prepared for winter. This is famous. Probably like 90% of you listening know this. But the Germans had been very confident that the war would end before winter hit. And so they had not equipped their troops with winter gear. And not having winter gear during a Russian winter is bad news. And it was even worse news in winter 41, because winter 41 was actually one of the worst winters in recorded history. So that was especially bad for that particular year. So all told, between Zhukov's successful defense of the city, combined with exhaustion by German troops, combined with weather conditions that the Germans were absolutely not prepared for, meant that the German advance stalled out completely by early December. They were just completely out of energy. They had nothing left to give. Now, it's also worth mentioning Siberian troops here. I used to think that Soviet reinforcements from Siberia helped tip the scales of this battle. That's not entirely true. It is partially true. It's true that the Soviets had an immense reserve of manpower stationed in the Far East in preparation for a potential war with Japan. And what I had thought is that those were released in November 1941 and were brought over en masse, and were not in place until December 41 when they took part in the big Soviet counteroffensive. What actually happened is that those troops were released starting more in September, October, and instead of being brought over all at once, they were brought over incrementally over time. So Siberian reinforcements actually started appearing relatively early, September, October. They just weren't brought over in any significant numbers. The balance of power in December 41 was sufficiently balanced that they probably did make a big difference, but it wasn't like there was just huge masses of Siberian troops suddenly charging out of the winter snow and destroying German forces rather. Instead, it was more just Siberian reinforcements slowly but surely reinforcing existing units over time and making them sturdier in the face of the German advance. So a little bit of a corrective there for a common misperception. For the curious, the reason they started releasing troops in late 41 was not just because of the severity of the war in the West. It was also because of a Soviet spy stationed in Germany. His name was Richard Sorge, I believe, and he's considered one of the great master spies of World War II, if not of the 20th century. He was actually German, but he was a German communist, and he had successfully made contact with the Comintern, which is basically the organization that organized international communists, I believe in the 1920s, maybe in the 30s. And he joined the Nazi Party as a double agent, basically. He joined up, infiltrated the party, and passed any number of secrets to the Germans. He eventually raised enough in the hierarchy that he was assigned as a diplomat to Japan. And while he was there, he successfully collected intelligence on Japan's war plans for World War II. Specifically, that they had decided not to attack the Soviet Union, but to go south instead and attack the United States and other Western imperial powers in the region. Now, that was big news for the Soviets, because they had not known that before. They had been sure that the Japanese were at least considering an invasion, and that until they knew for sure what the Japanese would do, they needed to have a large pool of manpower in the Soviet Far East to defend against that potential attack. As was, now that they had Richard Sorge's information that they were not going to attack, they started redistributing their forces west. I can't remember if it was before this or after this that the non-aggression pact with Japan was signed, but it was right around here anyway. And this more or less cemented the neutrality of the Soviet Union with regard to the Pacific War that would break out in a few months. So that's why the Soviets were able to finally release all the manpower in the Soviet Far East. And it was a lot. It was over 1 million troops that were stationed there. So try to keep that in mind, too. You could almost consider that another reason the Soviets struggled so much on the Western Front. They had 1 million men at arms that were tied down doing nothing on the other side of the country. If they'd had them available from the start of the war, things might have gone a little better for them. Okay, so the German... Go ahead.
Just for time, we're at about 3 hours. We can go a bit over, but just let me know.
Well, maybe we'll just do it next time then, because I don't know how much I can summarize 42, 43, 44, and 45 in just like 10, 15 minutes.
We can do a part 2.
But
this is really good.
But we could skip ahead to, we could finish 41 at least.
Sure.
So Germans, for a variety of reasons, run out of gas. Their offensive stalls out. They're very close. They do successfully surround Soviet forces at Bryansk, creating the Bryansk pocket. And they were in the process of surrounding the city of Tula to the southwest of Moscow. If you look at a map of the front line in like December 1st, 1941, you can see Tula almost completely encircled, except for a small bit of territory connecting them to the rest of the Soviet army. But just the Germans ran out of gas. Again, just nothing left. So that set the stage for the Soviet counteroffensive. And this is the first of what would be multiple winter counteroffensives in this period. But the biggest and most important was the first one, which happened in early December, and thrust back the Germans, I think, 50 kilometers to 100 kilometers away from Moscow. And, I should say it would be like more 20 to 50, because this is the first counteroffensive. So this is the one that really saved Moscow, pushed the Germans back, and made it very clear that the war was not anywhere near over. So that was the first big counteroffensive. It's also worth mentioning the first counteroffensive was very narrowly focused in and around Moscow. The second counteroffensive was more ambitious. This one saw much more, how do I put this? It had grander scope. It wasn't just the area around Moscow. It also involved offensives further north that were designed to destroy German positions south of Leningrad. And the idea there was to try to flank German forces around Leningrad and force them to retreat. There was also another offensive further south that was designed to eject German forces, I believe, from Rostov. And as I remember, that was successful. I think there was also another offensive, too, as part of this general second winter counteroffensive around Voronezh, which was sort of between Moscow and Rostov, roughly speaking. I don't think that one made much progress, though. Regardless, the biggest and most successful of these offensives here in the second general counteroffensive was around a city called Kulm. And the Kulm offensive would see Soviet forces form a pincher movement. Basically, there were two pinchers. One was targeting the city of Kulm, and then there was one further south. The southern pincher made no progress. It basically hit a wall. But the northern pincher was very successful, sliced through German lines, and successfully captured the city of Kulm. And the result of that offensive was the creation of a huge salient, which is basically like a big nub of territory that juts into your lines. And that German salient would continue to exist for the next year and change. The Soviets tried to crush it, but they just couldn't. The German defenses were too strong, even in their weakened state. It's also worth pointing out here that the style of fighting in this particular battle was different than the others. The others had been more organized up to this point. Even the Soviets, as dysfunctional as they were, still had something resembling a normal command and control system. But here, command and control almost collapsed for both sides. The attacking organized Soviet units were relatively organized, but the Soviets also attacked with paratroopers and partisans. As you can imagine, there were a lot of partisans, especially in Belarus, that had been left over from previous German offensives, and they had started systematically trying to sabotage the German war effort behind the front line. And they, combined with a bunch of Soviet paratroopers that were landed immediately behind the front line, such as it was at the time, immediately went to work attacking the rear of German forces. And the German forces at this point had basically lost cohesion. Like between the loss of equipment and the loss of personnel from the weather and the continuous fighting from the past 6 months, they actually just lost unit cohesion and disintegrated into a semi-organized mob. And there was actually real concern on the part of OKH that the German army was going to completely collapse at this point. It was really that bad. Their logistics were terrible. The men were exhausted. They were literally freezing to death. And they could not get them to respond to orders because in a lot of cases, they just couldn't even reach them. Now, Soviet forces had the initiative, but the Soviet forces in the rear were not in close contact with their commanders on the Soviet side of the lines. So the result was this kind of big melee, a big free-for-all between scattered German units, some of which would have been surrounded by partisans or even Soviet regulars, and some which had not, and also that were not being resupplied on account of the partisans and paratroopers cutting them off. And that lasted for probably around a week, and things were very touch and go at that point for the German army. What saved them for the first and last time in the war was intervention by Hitler. Hitler actually stepped in at this point and ordered all German troops to hold their positions and to defend them to the last man, which is a stupid thing to do. But in this case, in this one case in the entirety of World War II, it actually worked. And the German army actually was saved because of this. Even his critics in the German army gave him credit for this because they really didn't know what the fuck to do at this point. German lines stiffened, they survived the onslaught, and they were able to hold on, just barely, and fend off the Soviet offensive and survive it. Soviets were able to take some territory, but for the most part, the salient around Rzhev, as it would come to be called, was able to hold. There was also another salient to the north called the Demyansk salient that was a bit smaller that was also held. Demyansk was actually surrounded. The German unit there was completely surrounded, and the only reason it held out was because of air supplies that were dropped by the Luftwaffe. And this was actually part of the inspiration for the later attempt to relieve the German garrison in Stalingrad after it had been surrounded. Göring could, after this, successfully boast that he could supply a German ground unit by air, albeit a relatively small one. So while that was impressive in 41, the fact that they would try again was kind of stupid because that was way larger scale. We'll get to that later, if we ever have time. But Demyansk and Rzhev were basically the salients that were able to hold out because of Hitler's order. And the German army was thus saved, and the war was able to continue. The Soviets, for their part, were not really done. Even though their big onslaught in the second general counteroffensive hadn't really worked out, they would try again in a third. That started, I believe, in late December, early January. And this one is kind of more interesting. I would point out, just to kind of finish up with the second counteroffensive, the counteroffensives south of Leningrad both failed. I think one of them was the Lyubin offensive, and the other one was the Volkhov offensive. And the Volkhov offensive is the more notable one, because the Soviet general there, General Volkov, was actually, I believe his name was Volkov, was captured as a result of his defeat in the battle. And he actually switched sides. The Germans successfully convinced him to defect and to organize and lead a German unit of Russian defectors that wanted to fight against the Bolsheviks. He's considered one of the great traitors in World War II, as well as in Russian history. I don't remember the name. I think his name was Volkov, but I think I'm misremembering it as well. I don't know if we have any Russians listening, but they probably know him off the top of their head. Anyway, third general counteroffensive was just a general order for everybody to attack. This one was less organized, had fewer clear-cut objectives. Soviet leadership believed they had the Germans on the ropes, which they kind of did, but their mistake is that by this point, the German lines had consolidated, been reinforced, and they were kind of ready to go again. They were not ready for offensive operations, but more than ready for defensive operations. And Soviet officers at this point were still not well trained enough to avoid just walking into the teeth of an enemy's defenses. So the result of the third counteroffensive was pretty much disaster. The Soviets lost a good chunk of the reserves that they had been building up for these winter counteroffensives, and they largely came to nothing. There is one notable offensive that happened among this third tranche of offensives, and that was the Feodosia offensive. And this was an attempt by the Russians to reconquer Crimea, but instead of pushing into southern Ukraine and attacking from the north of the peninsula, they actually attacked across the narrow channel dividing Crimea from the Caucasus. Specifically, the Kerch Peninsula is that little bit of the Caucasus that juts out west towards Crimea. They actually launched an amphibious invasion of eastern Crimea from the Kerch Peninsula and created a beachhead from which they conducted further offensive operations into Crimea. Now, this is notable because there are very few amphibious operations that occurred over the course of the Eastern Front. In fact, I think this is pretty much the only one. But for that reason, it's pretty notable. You know, when you see the Eastern Front depicted, it's almost always snow, cold weather, people freezing to death. You don't really think of warmer climates, let alone amphibious operations, which are more associated with the Pacific War. But in this case, climate was warmer and you had amphibious operations. So some fun trivia for you. For the record, the Feodosia offensive never really went anywhere. The Soviets successfully established the beachhead. They pushed a few kilometers inland, but then the Germans were able to successfully stop them. And I think after a month or so of fighting, the Soviets were successfully ejected from the peninsula by the Germans. Now, from there, both sides kind of settled into a holding pattern. There was skirmishing. I think the Soviets tried for another offensive in mid-late January, but it was smaller in scope. It was all along the front, so I shouldn't say it's smaller in scope, but it had less power behind it because they had fewer reserves. Mostly it just served to eat up what manpower they had and weaken them. So not the smartest offensive, but that's generally what happened when Stalin intervened and ordered like a general broad-based offensive of that kind. Very destructive for the Red Army. But it did have the advantage of attriting the German forces still in the Eastern Front. By this point, the Germans had lost more forces fighting in the Eastern Front than they had in all of their offensive operations in the war to date. And it also hollowed them out. Never again would the Germans on the Eastern Front have as many people or as many vehicles or as many resources as they had in 1941. They had expended most of them in the first year. They would still be a potent force in 1942, but they would be significantly weakened. And it would only get worse from them from there. The Soviets, for their part, were in the process of evacuating industry and whatnot. I didn't really mention that, but one of the things that happened as the Germans advanced is that the Soviets picked up a lot of their heavy industry as much as they could and put it on railroads and railed it east, deeper into the country. As those factories would be set up again, over the course of early 42, they would start producing again and alleviate some of the shortages that the Red Army was facing. But at this point, they were still basically heavily dependent either on inventory or on what limited Lend-Lease was able to be brought into the country by the Western Allies. I would point out here that Lend-Lease was an important source of supply for the Soviet Union over the course of the war, but it didn't really pick up until 1943. 1941 saw really relatively little factory production in the Soviet Union on account of most of it being in the Western Soviet Union, and relatively little Lend-Lease. In 1942, you would see a lot more factory production in the Soviet Union as the factories that had been relocated started to set up and start producing again. But even then, there was still relatively Lend-Lease. It wasn't until 43 that you had both Soviet industry and Lend-Lease operating at full potential. So at this point in the war, in 1941, the Soviets are pretty much on their own. That said, there was some Lend-Lease that made it through, and I have read that while it was a small amount, it was able to arrive at a critical time. Going back to the Battle of Moscow, when General Zhukov was still trying to fend off the Germans advancing on Moscow, there actually had been a successful shipment from the West of Churchill tanks. These are the main battle tank of the British Army at that time. And Soviet inventory of tanks by this point had been sufficiently depleted that they really didn't have very many left at all. And so getting the shipment, with this shipment of British tanks at this part, in this part of the front, in this specific battle, comprised about half of the tanks that the Soviets had.
Wow.
Yeah. So half British, half Soviet at this point. Still not very many overall, but they had double the amount they would have otherwise with the British Lend-Lease. And so that probably did make a difference, you've got to think. I don't think the Soviets had a lot of respect for British tanks at that point, but better a bad tank at that point than no tank at all. So you could consider this an early contribution of Lend-Lease. Let's put it like that. We could talk more, but that gets into 1942, and that's a whole thing unto itself.
We've got an interesting chat to read. There was some discussion about the drugs that were given to soldiers on either side.
Everybody loves talking about methamphetamine in World War II.
Not just that. There was someone who said that they had their grandfather who fought in the Soviet army, and you got 100 grams of battle vodka.
Battle vodka.
Hey, if it takes the edge off and makes you less scared, then that's probably helpful.
Yeah.
Calm your nerves a bit. There might be a couple minor corrections of like the names of cities, and you have a few pronunciation things, but it was really fun to dig into World War II again. I know that's your main one, but there was a shitload going on in World War II, so there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, hopefully it's interesting. I don't think we've talked about it before, so hopefully this is mostly new for you.
Oh yeah, definitely so. Yeah, as a American perspective person, we were more entangled in the Pacific Theater, so I think most people have randomly heard of more of those events than the Eastern Front, because I don't think you've mentioned U.S. troops a single time in all of this, because it's between Germany and the Soviets primarily.
Oh yeah, U.S. wasn't even at war at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Pearl Harbor.
The early game.
Early game. Pearl Harbor would have happened right when the Soviets were fighting the Germans outside of Moscow.
Mm. You mentioned the factories being moved further inland for the Soviets, and that's a move that Terrans can do in StarCraft 2, where they can fly their buildings over to a safer location and then continue their production while salvaging the structure, which that saves you a lot of money. You don't have to rebuild a whole new facility. You're just like, hey, we don't really want to try to defend this here. This is a bad spot. Let's just go way over there, and then we'll make our tanks from there.
There you go.
Well, cool.
Well, did I really talk for 2 hours about that?
Yes, sir, you did. 3 hour, 20-minute episode. You can just roll. You give Agent Smith any World War II prompt, he can go. He's not going to run out. Because you can always take a tangent. You can always elaborate or expand on something. World War II had so much going on. There are so many different angles. And it's really fun to listen to. So I enjoy it a lot. And chat was saying they did too.
Well, good. Yeah, if I'd been better prepared, I'd be less rusty and maybe have a little more nuance and detail. But yeah, I'm glad it was still interesting.
Yeah. Well, next week I won't be able to do a world discussion, but the week after we can. So you have more time to play Stellaris and prep.
There you go. Well said.
Well, cool. Thanks for your expertise. Thank you, chat, for weighing in. And we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.